Harry Potter and the Rebirth. When Harry, who has experienced many twists and turns in his life, is reborn at the age of 9 with his past life memories and an inexplicable system, when Ron becomes a time traveler, when Draco and Harry become friends secretly and each of them is a king in public. When the Statute of Secrecy is broken and wizards are exposed to the sight of Muggles, when this world is no longer called the world. Chapter 1. Siege. Harry Potter, the boy who survived, the savior, the successor of Dumbledore, has become the black sheep today. These words kept flashing and distorting on the Daily Prophet. Below was a photo of Harry Potter. The man looked a little irritable, with red and bloodshot eyes, waving his wand around continuously. In Diagon Alley, people were holding newspapers and whispering to each other in groups of 2 or 3, discussing various issues, some denouncing, some lamenting, and some feeling sad. Some people had a hint of excitement on their faces, as if it was a very gratifying thing to see a high and mighty figure fall from the altar. The 3-foot-thick ice does not form overnight. The unacceptable actions of certain groups have finally become the last straw that broke the camel's back today. Some people were so angry that they rushed straight to the crowd that was talking and complained loudly, "If it weren't for Mr. Potter, would you be alive here today to talk about others? Kid, what do you know? Maybe a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul has entered Potter's body. We should do an exorcism to save him." A tall and strong man pushed the man away, shouted loudly, and waved his arms to the crowd around him, "We should sign a joint letter and ask the Ministry of Magic to examine the soul of our dear Mr. Potter. This is for our safety." The person who spoke had a serious face, a little anxious, and full of momentum, as if he was really worried about everyone. Some people nearby started to get agitated, showing excited expressions. The shadow left by the Dark Lord was too deep, making most people become frightened birds, especially when the wizarding world lost Dumbledore and there was no recognized strongest fighting force. The war that had just ended, as well as the threat posed by the rapid development of Muggle technology, had put the wizarding world in a precarious state. The emergence of surveillance cameras and the popularization of the internet have put the existence of confidentiality laws on the verge of collapse. Every wizard is thinking about where to go. In this depressed state, people urgently need an outlet to vent. Some forces have transferred this outlet to the current savior, but there is no Dumbledore to protect Potter anymore. Hearing this, Ron on the side could no longer hold back and punched him. "I told you to talk nonsense, you idiot." The natural strength advantage made the group itself extremely arrogant and high-handed, and did not pay more attention to this matter. The pure-blood families used this incident as an excuse to gang up on their dissidents rather than a wake-up call. The big man tilted his head to one side, and was a little confused for a moment, with an incredible look in his eyes. The person next to him was about to take out his wand, but when he saw the face that often appeared in the newspaper, he stopped the action in his hand. Ron then waved his wand, "Quickly restrain," and the big man was tied up with ropes all over his body. "Aurors are performing official duties. We suspect that this man is a remnant of the Death Eaters. Please cooperate." The crowd of onlookers scattered like birds. Hermione next to her looked at the man who was talking nonsense angrily. Her mouth moved slightly, and then the man immediately fell to the ground, face down, with a mouth full of dirt. In flourish and blots, Luna looked out the window at the chaos outside, turned around, slowly flipped through the book, and said softly, "There are a lot of harassment flies around Ron." "Hermione, well done," Ron came forward and said with a grin. Then, he said loudly to some people around him, "What are you still standing there for? Go and catch the person who just cooperated with the wizard. I want to see who this person is from." Hermione looked at Ron in admiration. "You observe carefully enough." She looked worried. "Harry will have to endure this for a while. This group of people are not simple. They know us too well and put us in a passive position." Seeing this, Ron leaned over to hug Hermione and touched her head, then was knocked down. At this time, 2 Aurors in the team whispered, "This Velis, his own ability is not very good, but he has found many backers. He found a minister as his wife, and his savior is his brother. His father and brother are both in high positions. Even his current position was arranged based on these relationships." "That's right. He was timid when the captain was not around, but now he is very impressive." Ron, who was far away, heard these words and his eyes flashed with embarrassment and hatred. Then, after seeing Hermione and George, he hit it again. "Ron, hasn't Harry written yet?" Hermione asked worriedly. "No, he must be feeling very uncomfortable now. He probably needs some time to rest." Ron said, squeezing his wand hard. George looked at Ron strangely, with an inquiring and somewhat suspicious look. 12 Grimmauld Place. The newspaper on the table was crumpled and some tea was dripping on it. In the dim room, there was a man curled up in the corner. He was thin, exuded an aura of decadence, and had a lightning-like scar on his forehead. At the other end of the room, there was a TV, which was out of place in the old house. The picture on it was flashing slightly. According to the Associated Press, Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom conferred the title of Knight on Miss Hermione Joan Granger at an outdoor ceremony at Windsor Castle on Friday. As the camera turned, Ron Velus's face appeared on the TV with a smile on his face. After hearing the familiar name, Potter's eyes turned red and filled with sadness. He stared straight ahead, his former courage and faith seemed to have disappeared. He looked at the two smiling people on TV with a complicated expression, his expression unclear, with a little disbelief and uncontrollable anger. After the Battle of Hogwarts, he applied for the Auror position, and within a few years, he became the captain due to his extraordinary ability and fame, and later married Ginny. Hermione also went to the Ministry of Magic and became the minister. Power, honor, and reputation were all concentrated on this group of people at the time, and even the pure-blood families at the time had to avoid them for a while. Reputation became his shackles. Killing Voldemort made him recognized as the most powerful wizard in the wizarding world. His every move was given meaning and magnified infinitely. There are also some people who may only be able to share adversity but not wealth. Dumbledore has the ability and strength to manage this heavy honor, but for Potter, this is more difficult than confronting Voldemort. Potter was traumatized by the war, and at first he would dream of his godfather falling, Dumbledore falling from the tower, and Professor Snape's black eyes. Later, in his dream, he stretched out his hands countless times, desperately ran forward, trying to catch them, fell countless times, got up again, stumbled to the ground, stumbled. Even if he finally caught them, everything would turn into bubbles at his fingertips, colorful bubbles so dreamy, and so fragile. Finally, when I opened my eyes, I saw the bright morning, the quiet time, and the admiring gazes of others everywhere, but what I had to endure was the cruel reality accompanied by heartache. Chapter 2. Crossing. Porter's heart was tortured. He asked himself why he couldn't save them, why he wanted them to sacrifice, and why he deserved to enjoy fame, reputation, and wealth. Death Eaters put on the clothes of pure-blood families and escaped judgment, heroes put on coffins, sprinkled mud on them, and fell into death. And I, the person they protected, was powerless to change anything. I could only have the title of savior and deceive myself that I had tried my best. Potter couldn't stand it anymore. He banged his head against the wall madly. Blood flowed from his forehead to his cheeks, dripped onto his collar, and soaked into his clothes. Creaker in the dark watched the scene in front of him, secretly happy, and whispered, "The current master is a damn half-blood, but Creaker has to obey the orders of the previous master and serve someone who does not belong to the Black family." After that, he disappeared from the old house with a puff. During a mission, Porter acted too aggressively and accidentally killed a person who should not have died. On the day he was surrounded by reporters, he lost his composure. There were many comments at once, and Porter looked at the crowd, feeling a little pleased, and he felt that he did not deserve to enjoy these things. Facing the crowd that denounced him, he felt an incomparable peace in his heart, so he let the comments spread. In a corner where no one cared, a golden pendant hanging on his body was flashing a cold light in the box. Two people in the distance were wearing black cloaks, hiding in the dark, looking at the savior who was now on the verge of mental collapse, silently. One of them was determined and coldly cruel, while the other looked at the man wearing the vortex with heartache. Owls were flying all over the sky towards his and Ginny's home, and red howling letters were rubbing against the windows. The people who protected him had already died in the war, and part of the incident was indeed his fault, which he could not refute. Porter accepted the charge. Later, Potter could not bear to see his friend embarrassed for him, so he took the initiative to resign from his position and paid the corresponding price. The brave Gryffindor never loses the courage and confidence to face life again. Ron and Hermione supported his decision and said that he should take a good rest. He began to compensate the family that he accidentally killed and tried his best to make up for it. He told his wife that he wanted to travel around the world and refused her company. Porter began to wander around and say goodbye to his friends. He strolled beside the pyramids in Egypt, traveled through the rainforest, and listened to the bells coming from ancient Chinese temples. He would stand on the top of Mount Everest and look at the magnificent world, with bar-headed geese flying over the top and flags on the nearby peaks floating slowly like brocade and satin. He would also sit quietly in a coffee shop in New York, watching the Muggles running around in a hurry, tall buildings standing in the distance, and the golden red sun hanging in the middle of the buildings. Sometimes he would shuttle through the hail of bullets from the Muggles, looking at the red, white, and black national flags arranged in order under his feet, and watching the blood and flesh flying around him, and the purgatory on earth. Sometimes, he would still think of the freedom-loving elf Dobby who died in his arms, the Velis twins who became the eternal mirror of East, and the Lupin couple lying on the ground. However, pity the living, Potter thought, this person does not include himself. Potter was swallowed by his own thoughts, but he wanted to pull himself out. Every time he went to a place, he would go back to his godfather's house to stay for a while. No matter what he did, this place could make him feel peaceful. The burrow belonged to others, but this place belonged to him and his godfather. He looked at the portrait of Sirius hanging on the wall, but he was not here in the picture. Let him think about it. Well, he should go to his father's place now. Oh, and there was Lupin. Once again, I returned to the old house, a place that no one could enter. The evening sunlight slanted through the window, shone on the floor, and gradually moved on to Harry. Hey, Pot, I heard that you hid yourself in a cowardly way. The former savior can't even deal with such a small storm, Pot. With a burst of apparition explosion, Draco's figure suddenly appeared, with an upright figure, wearing a slim black suit, hiding on the other side of the light. The golden sunlight shone on the pair of black leather shoes. It was the art of the intersection of light and darkness. The current steady and smooth head of the Malfoy family appeared at the home of his rival. Potter slowly raised his head, his eyes were red and his hair was messy. Draco was stunned for a moment when he saw this scene. They had always been at loggerheads with each other, and he had never seen Potter like this before. Hey, Pot, what are you doing? Malfoy gradually approached, walking from darkness to light, and then from light to darkness. As for Potter, he had been standing at the junction of light and shadow, quietly watching Malfoy walking towards him. He wanted to pull Potter up, just like Potter had pulled him up in the Fiend Fire. However, glancing at the greasy clothes Potter was wearing on the ground, he frowned in disdain and mocked, "When did you learn to be like Snape?" and pinched Potter's hand with 2 fingers. Suddenly, he felt something hard, and when he looked closely, it was a box, which Potter held tightly. Malfoy felt a sudden pain in his finger, and bright red blood flowed from his fingertips into the locket. A golden light flashed by. "Potter, what is this thing you are holding?" "It's really..." Potter opened his eyes wide in surprise. How could Malfoy suddenly disappear? It was quiet now, just like the countless days in the past, with only his shadow to hang out with him. The dust in the air slowly flowed under the sunlight, creating different pictures, mysterious and gorgeous. Another golden light flashed, and Potter's figure also disappeared. Only the images on the TV were still rolling tirelessly. Well-known people talked about the Queen's deep meaning for this appointment, and one of them mentioned that Ms. Hermione. At this time, on the street in front of number 11 Grimmauld Place, Ginny was walking around anxiously. "I'm really panicking, just like the time when Dad was attacked at the Ministry of Magic that night." Hermione comforted her, "Harry has faced the you-know-who before, are you still worried about him getting into danger? Let's see if we can get in. Harry has reset the confidentiality of the old house again," Hermione said somewhat complainingly. Ron glanced at his watch, looking extremely happy. Ginny happened to see this and she looked straight into her brother's eyes. "Brother, do you know anything?" Ginny suppressed her emotions and asked softly with a hint of request. Chapter 3. Riot. Still sleeping, still sleeping. A series of banging sounds woke Harry up from his coma. He stood up suddenly. The surrounding environment was dark and narrow, and there were piles of debris. Wasn't this the stairwell where he slept before he was 11 years old? It was such a real dream. Harry suddenly felt at home, but at the same time he was controlled, and the feeling of violent suffocation and oppression came to his mind at random, making him extremely irritable. He had to get up early and stay up late to prepare meals for them, and he was violent in words and actions. He turned on the gas when he was too young to reach the stove, and he wore clothes that Dudley didn't want. In order to survive, he became a servant of Petunia's family. At a growing age, he curled up in a small cubicle, feeling Dudley jumping up and down the stairs all day long, with dust all over his face filling the small space, making his lungs feel extremely uncomfortable. At that time, he should have been a life-size toy of Dudley, right? He thought to himself with self-mockery. But, this was a voice he hadn't heard for a long time, as if everything hadn't happened yet and there was still a chance to save it. He stood up, pulled the door open, and looked up. Aunt Petunia's face was hidden in the light, radiating light. He had never felt that this woman was so kind, and the annoyance in his heart dissipated a little. He hugged Aunt Petunia's waist tightly, rested his head on her belly, and said in a distorted voice, "It's great, old friend." Petunia's face was full of shock, and she didn't push him away for a moment. At this time, Uncle Vernon came down in his pajamas, saw this scene, and hurriedly pushed Harry away. "Little bastard, what's wrong with you?" He blushed and pointed at Harry with a trembling finger, as if he had done something unforgivable. Petunia came to her senses and wanted to grab Harry's ears and give him a severe lesson. But somehow, Harry dodged it flexibly, rushed to the kitchen, snatched a piece of bread from Dudley's hand, sat on the stool, crossed his legs, and began to eat slowly. Dudley looked at his empty hands, glared at Harry angrily, and then immediately howled loudly in grievance. Harry leaned back in his chair, looked at the shocked family of three, and said happily, "I've wanted to do this for a long time, it doesn't matter if it's not real." Then he sighed and rubbed his shoulders on the stool, "It's really exciting." It was not until Uncle Vernon grabbed his ears tightly, threw him into the stairwell, and informed him that he could not eat for 2 days, that Harry began to realize that this was not a dream. "Oh, Malfoy!" Harry then remembered that Malfoy had come before he fell into a coma. "Potter, what did you do to me? How did I get into your brain?" Malfoy, who had just woken up in his mind, was a little panicked. He looked around, and his platinum hair flew everywhere as his owner moved too much. Harry heard this and looked around. Very good, no one suddenly appeared in the small and shabby house. Then, he felt around with his arms. Very good, it was neither the invisibility cloak nor the disillusionment charm. Spell stopped, no reaction. "Potter, use your troll brain, stupid Gryffindor." Malfoy looked at Potter wandering around in the small room, ignoring him, and was immediately so angry that his eyes widened. He wondered how he, the head of the Malfoy family, had ended up in such a situation. Harry thought, maybe the dream hasn't ended yet, otherwise why would I dream about Malfoy? Malfoy saw Harry's mental activities in his mind with subtitles thoughtfully added. Harry forced himself to believe the truth of the matter. After all, this unique language style, coupled with a condescending tone, can only be fully demonstrated by Malfoy himself. He suppressed his disgust and was about to say something, but then he thought of Malfoy. His mind was like eating the special dung eggs made by the Velis twins. His brows were furrowed and his stomach juice surged. Ever since he started traveling around the world, nothing could stir his mood like this. "Potter, how dare you despise me?" Malfoy was furious in Potter's mind. He looked at the surroundings and wanted to teach Potter a lesson, but it was like punching cotton. No spell could be cast. "Potter, do you know?" Harry frowned and wanted to hear the next sentence, but Malfoy kept silent. Harry felt like he had been tricked. He wanted to find out where Malfoy was in his soul, but since he had no knowledge of the soul and was afraid of damaging his brain, he could not do anything. If only Hermione was here, Harry thought, she would always find the right way to do it. Harry felt like there was a time bomb in his brain. It was a joke. How could he be at ease with Malfoy in his brain? But at this moment, he had to think carefully. Malfoy was suspended in a mysterious space, with some ancient runes floating around him. Well, if he had known, he would have signed up for it when he was selecting courses. He felt that he could gain powerful power in this space, such as fiend fire. Malfoy looked at the white flames that suddenly appeared in his hands, feeling a little unreal. Along with the energy came an inexplicable feeling towards Harry, which was a bit strange. He sniffed and consciously avoided it. Who would have thought of a broken special? Recalling the scene just now, Malfoy wiped his mouth in disgust. He was sure that the little thing must have other ways to make him silent. He was suspended under a starry sky, magic was surging quietly, different elements were rubbing against each other, sparks were flashing. Malfoy was quietly feeling the sudden power and emotions, waiting for the arrival of fate in the dark. Harry tried to cast a spell without a wand, and the cup flew over. The milk in Dudley's hand flew uncontrollably toward the stairwell where Harry was. Dudley opened his eyes wide in horror, watching the milk as if it were alive, desperately slamming against the stairwell door. "Ah, Mommy!" He began to spin around the table frantically, and hearing the sound, Penny hurried down the stairs, What's wrong, my little Dudley?" When Penny saw this scene, she was shocked at first, then her expression was complicated, and there was some reminiscence of the past in her eyes. "Oh, Harry walked out of the stairwell. "Good morning, Auntie, I'm a little thirsty, this is what Cousin Dudley kindly gave me." He winked at Petunia, then turned to look at Dudley, who was standing there in a daze. "Thank you, Cousin." He took the floating milk in one hand, drank a sip, sipped it, a circle of milky white beard appeared around him, then raised the glass to signal Dudley, and went upstairs. Dudley's eyes were full of disbelief. He tried to grab the milk, but was bounced away as soon as he approached Harry. "Oh, Dudley baby!" Petunia seemed to have just reacted to Harry's abnormal behavior, and she hurried to help Dudley. Uncle Vernon heard the noise and came downstairs to see what was happening, and happened to meet Harry, who was going upstairs. He opened his mouth in surprise and was about to pull Harry down, but for some reason, he floated downstairs by himself. "Penny, did you let Harry out?" Vernon forced himself to ignore the things that were wrong around him, hoping to find the reason from Penny to explain it all. Penny didn't say anything. She opened her mouth and stared blankly at Harry's back as he went upstairs. Vernon shifted his gaze again and looked straight at the ground, where there was a large mass of something. "Dudley!" Vernon was shocked. Vernon turned around and roared. Vernon rushed to the stairs, and Vernon was thrown away. Plop! There was another lump on the ground. Chapter 4. Mission. Harry listened to the roar downstairs and shook his head helplessly. Why is it still like this? But the joy in his expression was hard to hide. His mood suddenly became low again. He thought to himself, "Wait, if this is true, I will definitely not accept the original ending." Harry's heart began to ache again. He continued to decorate his little house, casting the Traceless Extension Charm and the Muggle Repelling Charm. As for the Ministry of Magic, he had long forgotten about it. Suddenly, a fierce stabbing pain swept through Harry's brain, and a stream of red liquid flowed from his nose. Ah! He fell heavily to the ground, and his small body curled up on the floor. Then, blood started to flow from his 7 orifices. Harry endured the pain, which was like a burning fire, just like the pain he had suffered when he was being tortured. He couldn't help but scream, but there was silence all around him. Then, he heard a sharp scream in his ears, and then his head went blank and he lost consciousness. Penny and her family were anxiously pacing around the door of their house because they suddenly couldn't find their home since some time ago. Hogwarts, Headmaster's office. Dumbledore sat on a chair, staring at a corner of the room, his deep blue eyes wondering what he was thinking. The fire in the fireplace was crackling, and there were a few cockroaches scurrying around on the table. Dumbledore picked up a few and put them in his mouth, revealing an expression of enjoyment. Suddenly, as if he sensed something, he waved his hands, and immediately a bat-like figure rushed in. "Dumbledore, there is a huge magical fluctuation in Harry's area." Snape looked anxious and slapped his hands on Dumbledore's desk. A few cockroaches unfortunately died under Snape's palms, and he frowned in disgust, and then his hands immediately became clean again. Dumbledore's expression immediately became serious, and the portraits of the headmasters on the surrounding walls began to move. They all knew what this meant. He pulled the corner of Snape's clothes, and with a puff, the two of them disappeared in the office. In the high tower of Nurmengard, Austria, an old man sat on the ground. As if he felt something, silver substance was flowing in his deep eyes, his frowning brows relaxed, and the whole person was rejuvenated. He murmured in a low voice, "Albus, you and I finally have a glimmer of hope. I should make some preparations. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey." 2 figures suddenly appeared on the house. "Dumbledore, can't we go downstairs? Look at what a good place you have chosen." Snape frowned, with a sullen face, spitting venom at the greatest white wizard in the world today with an expressionless face. "Snape, let's go downstairs and take a look." Dumbledore smiled good-naturedly, but then he stopped laughing. Harry fell to the floor covered in blood, his face pale, as if he was about to die. The healing spell of healing was useless here, and Harry was still bleeding. "Dumbledore, is this what you promised me, that you would put him in a safe place?" Snape questioned, his eyes bloodshot. Dumbledore didn't say anything. He gently picked up Harry, his eyes full of worry and anger. He looked at the Muggle Repelling Charm and the Traceless Casting Charm, thinking, "Let's go back to Hogwarts and find Madame Pomfrey first." There were 2 more puff sounds, and the staff from the Ministry of Magic arrived late. They looked at Petunia and her family, who were wandering at the door, and fell into silence. What was going on? In the school hospital, Madame Pomfrey drove the two out. Go away, don't disturb me here. Dumbledore stood outside the door. Fawkes, he said. A red phoenix suddenly appeared. Go. Fawkes nodded humanely, then stood on Harry and shed a few tears. Dumbledore suppressed his anger, and there seemed to be a storm brewing in his deep blue eyes, which was chilling. The violent fluctuations of magic created air waves. Snape, Dumbledore looked at Snape and gestured. Snape nodded, turned around and strode away. Not simple, it's indeed not simple, George, what do you think? Of course we should go in and take a look, Fred, snapped the twins, hid in a corner and clapped their hands quietly. They watched the professors receding back, and waited patiently for Madame Pomfrey to leave, then quietly slipped into the school infirmary. Wow, look what we found, little Harry, injured little Harry, oh, poor little Harry covered in blood. The twins hugged each other tightly, looking at Harry lying on the bed, and said in unison. Harry's consciousness entered a mysterious area, with the starry sky above and hard and thick soil on the ground, many strange plants growing on it, mysterious and deep in the distance, with the shadow of a huge monster in the distance. In the near distance, there were densely covered ancient runes, and the golden words were quietly swimming, as if they had vitality. Not far away, Malfoy, dressed in a black suit, was quietly suspended in the air, his chin slightly raised, his entire face bathed in starlight, his arms hanging down relaxedly, his eyes closed, and his platinum hair floating gently. Harry looked at the quiet Malfoy and was stunned for a moment. They had always been at loggerheads with each other and had wanted to beat each other up for a long time, but they had reached a tacit understanding without words. Looking at Malfoy, who was as harmless as a baby, and thinking of the hand he had extended at that time, Harry didn't know what attitude to take towards him for a moment. Mr. Potter, a voice sounded from behind Harry. He turned around hastily, only to see a ferret quietly floating in the air. Harry recalled a memory. Malfoy was originally turned into a ferret. He couldn't help laughing. Sir, please be serious, the little ferret tried to pretend to be serious, but Harry really couldn't be serious. This is a map waiting to be explored by the host, Mr. Malfoy. The ferret ignored Harry, paused, and spoke to himself. Every once in a while, the map will randomly absorb a person who is closest to the host and gain his vitality until he dies. The host can choose to save him or not. It is up to the host to decide. The ferret didn't care what effect these words would have on Harry. Of course, the system itself is to serve the host. The wealth, soul, memory, etc. of the person absorbed will be possessed by the host. The same goes for curses and the dark side of the soul. Please consider carefully, host. More functions are waiting to be developed by the host. After speaking, the weasel changed into some light and electricity, rushed to the distance, and turned into a huge magical creature. It flew into the air, its wings covering the sky, and in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. Harry was unable to accept such a huge amount of information for a moment. Based on his years of travel experience, this space seemed like a complete world. How did he enter this place? Was he really absorbing life? He wanted to verify the information given by this creature. Harry walked slowly towards Malfoy, but halfway there he was blocked by a transparent wall. With a bang, his glasses almost embedded into his face. Oh, that hurts, Harry said, rubbing his face and grinning. Then, a line of small words appeared on the glass wall. Host permissions have not been unlocked, please complete the corresponding tasks before trying again. Below it was written in a smaller line, Task 1, please ask the host to eliminate Dumbledore's suspicion of you. Chapter 5. Principal. Just as Harry squinted his eyes to see more clearly, the ferret reappeared on the other side of the transparent wall, its face pressed against the wall, its small black eyes facing Harry's green eyes, with a humanized teasing expression in them. Oh, I forgot to tell you, because the map requires a lot of soul power, so when I first settled down, I accidentally took some of yours to use. What, used my soul? Harry seemed to realize why he was bleeding from all 7 orifices. He used extremely polite words to entertain the creature that had just appeared and greeted its family cordially, thereby expressing Harry's own great respect for it. By the way, what should I do? Who should I save? Harry was kicked out before he could express any more questions. The weasel inside the wall looked at the polite child speechlessly. Well, his quality and psychological endurance need to be improved. It silently called up the panel and adjusted the task level from light color to dark red. The ding-dong sound sounded for a long time. Malfoy, who was far away, was awakened. He felt his restraints becoming increasingly strict, and vaguely felt that it was related to the little thing not far away. The world in front of Harry's eyes suddenly turned white, and then he suddenly felt his eyes brighten, and two noses appeared in front of Harry, and he could even clearly see the nose hairs in the nostrils. "Ah!" Harry screamed, wondering whose naughty kid was this. The Velis twins straightened up, and the two people standing by the bed began their performance. "Oh, I'm so sad that Harry's reaction was like this," George performed. "That's right, we were kind enough to show him the building we carefully built in his nostrils," Fred responded. Harry was somewhat speechless. Building a building in his nostrils, little big deal? He showed a smiling expression, first staring at George, and trying to find embarrassment in his eyes, but there was none. Then he turned his head and stared at Fred, a slight pain sweeping through his heart. Harry began to frown and Fred panicked. What was going on? Madame Pomfrey came in from outside, saw the twins, and immediately started to drive them away. "Hurry, go to class and don't disturb the patient's rest here." The twins slowly moved to the door of the school infirmary, and looked back at Harry with every step, as if they were a young couple saying goodbye to life and death. Harry was amused, what a funny couple, but when he thought of their final ending, what was the ending? A sour feeling surged to his eyes and nose, but was immediately confused by the blankness in his mind. "You'll come to see me again, right?" Harry looked at them pleadingly and asked, trying to understand what had just happened. The twins were a little confused by Harry's attitude, but then they became excited again. "How can you not come when the Savior invites you, right, George?" "Yes, Fred," Harry did not refute when he heard this, as if someone had called him that a long time ago. Madame Pomfrey began to become impatient. She waved her wand and the twins were immediately pushed out the door. With a scream of "cool," the door closed. "Harry," Madame Pomfrey put on a gentle expression and asked softly, "how do you feel? Where does it hurt?" She looked at the thin boy on the hospital bed, and remembered how he was covered in blood this morning, and she couldn't help feeling pity for him. "No, thank you, ma'am." "Oh, little Harry," Madame Pomfrey seemed pleased by the name, and her expression softened. "Harry, how do you feel?" At this time, an old but powerful voice reached Harry's ears. It was Dumbledore. Hearing this familiar voice, Harry's eyes immediately turned red. He stared blankly at the door, like a scene that had appeared countless times in his dreams. Soon tears rushed into his eyes, blurring the world in front of him. Many tears slid down his cheeks to his neck. He felt as if his heart was pulled out fiercely, then thrown to the ground and stepped on heavily several times. He was having trouble breathing, and Harry grabbed his collar, silently wondering what he should do. Seeing this, Madame Pomfrey turned around to get a prepared reagent, walked quickly to the bedside, and said, "Child, drink it quickly." When Harry heard this voice, he felt like he had grabbed a life-saving straw. He rudely snatched the potion and drank it in one gulp. Dumbledore at the door was a little surprised when he saw this scene. He could feel that Harry's big reaction was because of him. Why? He had never seen Harry when Harry was conscious, so why did Harry have such strong feelings for him? And, Savior, how did he know? Dumbledore was sure that Harry had never been in contact with the magical world for so many years. He realized something was wrong. Polyjuice potion? He walked closer and looked Harry straight in the eyes, into those emerald green eyes that were filled with sadness. Dumbledore was startled, but his worry slowly settled down. It seemed that this child had some adventure. But he got a blank, such a powerful brain block. Dumbledore was secretly alert. At this time, the alarm sounded in Harry's mind. Warning, warning, due to the host's behavior, Dumbledore begins to suspect the host. The mission is about to fail. The punishment for failure will be to drain 1/3 of Malfoy's lifespan. Harry was a little panicked. He didn't expect that Dumbledore would find something wrong after just one encounter. Seeing Malfoy's face turning pale in his mind, Harry decided to do something. Following his instinct, Harry threw back the covers and rushed towards Dumbledore barefoot. Dumbledore noticed Harry's movements and secretly grasped his wand. In today's magical world, he was not afraid of being attacked by anyone. But it didn't seem like an attack, and he didn't sense any malicious intent, so he quietly removed the protective barrier. He was very curious about what the child was going to do. Dumbledore felt his stomach tightened and his belly was warm. He thought he had eaten too much this morning and felt a little uncomfortable. He looked down and saw Harry hugging him tightly with his arms, pressing his face against the purple wizard robe he was wearing today. It looked like his grandson. Did he have a grandson? Dumbledore was amused by his sudden imagination. Madame Pomfrey was caught off guard by Harry's sudden action. Child, why are you? She wanted to pull Harry out, but Dumbledore stopped her with his eyes. Child, what's wrong with you? Dumbledore asked in a low voice. To be honest, except for his childhood brothers and sisters and that person, he had never been so close to anyone in his life. This feeling was very new. People say that he is the greatest wizard of the world, but they are not close enough to him and are more respectful than helpful. Dumbledore wants to feel the warmth of an ordinary person and the strong admiration for him. As for whether he was pretending, he had never considered this possibility. After all, that was Harry. Harry stood there in a daze. He was so overwhelmed by his strong emotions that he didn't know what to do next. Was it Merlin who gave him the courage? Malfoy had been lying flat in Harry's mind, watching Harry charge into battle, fighting for his own life, leisurely and comfortable. Don't ask him how he knew it. It's nonsense. The words are written in such big letters. If he can't see it, he must be blind. But how dare Potter, Malfoy roared in despair in his mind, this stupid troll, is this Gryffindor? I just saw that you were very close, as if we were in a previous life, us. Harry was a little at a loss for words. What should he say next? Did he die in his previous life, just a few years later? Why did he die? Once again, Harry wanted to strangle the ferret to death. He lowered his arms, looked down at his toes. Oh, he wasn't wearing shoes, and the tips of Harry's ears were red and starting to smoke in the sunlight. Chapter 6. Failure. A human steam engine? This Harry is really something. Dumbledore saw his embarrassment and his eyes revealed a hint of pleasure. Such a shy and timid child should not be a big problem. He didn't mean to embarrass him any further, so he took over the conversation in a sympathetic manner. Kid, maybe you were just injured and a little scared, so it's normal for you to subconsciously seek help from adults. The ground is cold, kid, hurry up and sit on the bed. Snape heard these words at the entrance of the school hospital room. He wondered if Dumbledore had been replaced by someone else, or if he had eaten too much sugar and his brain was damaged. Why did those sweet words not sound like they came from the mouth of the greatest wizard of the time? He leaned against the wall at the entrance of the school hospital, not wanting to go in. Harry came down the ladder. He quickly returned to the bed, pulled the quilt over his legs and leaned back in the chair. Excuse me, who are you? Harry forced himself not to think about anything, trying to make himself look like a 9-year-old child, bewildered and innocent. Child, I am the headmaster of this school. You can call me Mr. Dumbledore directly. School? Why do I remember I was still at home? Harry asked knowingly, and used his lifelong acting skills in this scene that was so familiar that it couldn't be more familiar. Child, it seems you need to know something in advance, Dumbledore said kindly with a wink. But Harry clearly sensed a certain wariness and alertness in his eyes, which even Dumbledore himself was not aware of. This discovery made him feel a little cold, as if the warm scene just now only existed in his fantasy. Headmaster Dumbledore might be kind enough to help him out, or he might soften his heart because of some actions, but he had experienced 2 generations of dark wizards, became the president of the International Confederation of Wizards, was recognized as the strongest wizard, supported Fudge to come to power, dealt with pure-blood families, was feared by Voldemort, and was afraid to act rashly. How could he trust someone easily? Trust was the most luxurious thing for him. Dumbledore would never let down his guard and suspicion easily, even if he was the savior, let alone now when there were so many loopholes. Harry comforted himself in his heart. The flaw will not disappear if ignored, but will become bigger and bigger as time goes by. He never thought that the first meeting with his most beloved principal would be like this. In less than a moment, the Velis twins spread the news of Harry Potter's arrival at Hogwarts throughout the school, causing a great sensation. Percy had just returned from the library when he saw his 2 younger brothers instigating a group of people to go to the infirmary, saying that Harry was coming. Really, he felt his temples throbbing, although he also wanted to see the legendary savior. However, judging by the twins' record, this was probably just some interesting trick. They had said before that Merlin was coming. Percy spotted Professor McGonagall in the distance, and he hurriedly pulled the Velis twins off the stool, and threatened in a low voice that if they shouted again, he would write to their mother. The twins smiled bitterly, You're just learning Ginny's tricks. Go away, you snitch, George, the twins mocked loudly, took some food, and escaped from Percy's grasp like a loach. Seeing this, the others dispersed. Was it another joke by the twins? No one dared to offend Madame Pomfrey. In the school infirmary, after Dumbledore asked the information he wanted to know, he looked at the uneasy Harry in front of him, then glanced at Snape standing at the door, and considerately left first. Madame Pomfrey gave Harry a potion and told him to rest. Ding! The host's mission failed, and 1/3 of Malfoy's lifespan was absorbed. When Harry heard the news, his originally rosy cheeks began to turn pale again. As a warm current flowed through his blood vessels, his pale face began to turn healthy again, and his facial features began to change slowly. Harry's whole temperament was closer to Malfoy. The sunlight penetrated the window and shone on his face. Half of his face was hidden in the photocopy. His flying wild eyebrows were like a sword, which was sheathed at the end, showing the owner's unstoppable momentum and careful planning. Emerald eyes, vibrant green under the sun, green pools deep in the dark forest under the shadow, light, and darkness, perfectly blended on the same person's face. Straight nose, rosy lips, pale skin that still has a sickly color. Although he is just a child, he has a sacred and inviolable dignity and nobility, as if he was born to be a king. Harry didn't realize this, he immediately closed his eyes and sank his consciousness into his mind. Looking at Malfoy's weak appearance, he felt extremely guilty and angrily wanted to break the transparent glass wall, but to no avail. In just a short while, so many flaws were revealed. Malfoy in his mind was speechless. The lifespan that was sucked away made him extremely angry but helpless. It seemed that he had to train Potter. It was time to show some real skills. Malfoy became much calmer at this moment, as if what was sucked away was not his lifespan but his pride and prejudice, adding a lot of convincing temperament. Potter, listen, I'm here to help you. Malfoy suppressed his emotions, wearing a black suit and black leather shoes, slowly walked towards the transparent glass and waved to Harry. What can I do? Harry, wearing a white hospital gown and running barefoot to the glass wall, asked hurriedly. Malfoy came to the glass wall and motioned Harry to come closer. Neither of them noticed that as they approached each other, a white circle of light faintly appeared on the ground, forming a contract. With a flick of the butterfly of fate, the development of the magic world turned towards another unknown direction. While Harry was unconscious, Dumbledore appeared in the infirmary again with a probing look. Harry had just been given a magical reapparition potion, not polyjuice potion. Metamorphmagus, no, the magic of love has not disappeared. So, what is this abnormality? Is it related to the time converter, or is it a travel from another time and space? At this time, Snape followed in. He looked at Harry lying on the bed with a dark and complex expression. He stared at Harry lying on the bed, trying to find traces of his old friend on his face. Snape looked for a long time, but all he saw was that annoying Potter. He turned his head away, not wanting to make things more difficult for himself. Dumbledore smiled at Snape. He hadn't seen such a lively expression on his face for a long time. Snape whispered that the Malfoy family didn't know about this. Dumbledore nodded without saying anything more. Everything will slowly reveal itself over a long period of time, so he decided to let Harry stay in Hogwarts and teach him personally. Something had changed in the Savior that he wasn't aware of, and he needed to get along slowly to assess whether this experience would have an impact on his plans. As for the blood magic, he would let Harry live there for a while every year. Chapter 7. Giving money. Ding, host, please complete the next task. Then my first task is completed. Harry asked. The system ignored it and continued to issue the next task. Host, please pay the Dursley family the support money for these years. Please complete it within 2 hours. Harry was a little unhappy when he heard that. Is it for the family that abused him? Why? But his only remaining conscience reminded him that they had truly raised him in the past few years and taken care of him when he was a child. As a second-generation man, he already understood what it meant to prioritize and distinguish between gratitude and resentment. He held his nose and endured it. It is impossible for us to become relatives and live together as a family. The only thing I can repay is that I have been given a place to settle down over the years, whether he is willing or not, during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, the turbulent times, and the economic depression. Gratitude is gratitude, and grudges are grudges, Harry thought, and was even a little impatient. He continued to use that place as a hotel, and regarded it as a transaction between the two parties. And after years of abuse, Harry thought, he deserved a little punishment. Malfoy looked at the thoughts in Harry's mind and felt a little disappointed. He really is worthy of being the savior. What a saint, he secretly mocked in his heart, but he felt much more at ease. Logically speaking, since he had no relatives or friends and had even been enemies for a period of time, he should have worried that Harry would give up halfway. However, he did not expect that Harry would be so soft-hearted towards those who abused him. Then, as someone who once wanted to help him, wouldn't he be even more dedicated? Harry did what he said. He sneaked out while Madame Pomfrey was away, but he needed someone to lead the way. Although he knew where the headmaster's office was, he couldn't really find it by himself. In a huge cave, several giant dragons were playing cards together. There was a square stone table as big as 16 basketball courts, which was piled with gold, silver, and jewelry. Next to it were huge stones with mysterious words engraved on them. Next to the stone table was a 9-story high stool. The little white dragon flew to the side of a giant silver dragon, and when it stood up, it was not even as tall as the stool. "Mom, I'm still full today. Where are we going to eat? Which restaurant is it?" "Number 19. The taste is okay, just so-so." "It's getting blurry, stop chatting," said a green female dragon nearby. "Be good, go play." "Okay, Mom, I'm leaving." The little dragon flapped its wings and flew away from the cave. In restaurant number 19, the room was filled with heat and fragrance. The giant creatures were shouting loudly and playing guessing games. The little dragon flew in and called out, "Dad!" The giant dragon next to him ignored him. "I took one and went out to play," the giant dragon heard it this time. "Just take it," he said nonchalantly. "Go and play by yourself," the giant dragon drove him over. Xiao Long flew out of the restaurant angrily. Harry left the school infirmary and walked a little further. From a distance, he saw a tall figure in front of him. "Hey," he quickened his pace with joy. "Hello, senior, could you please take me to the principal's office?" The figure in the distance gradually approached. Harry looked at the friendly face, but also felt a little heartbroken. "This person has a good relationship with me," he thought secretly in his heart. "It's really you, Harry." "Hello, my name is Cedric." The young man looked very comfortable, handsome, and gentle, with a cheerful temperament. His smile was like the sun, warming people's hearts. He was a decent person, based on Harry's many years of experience in judging people. Harry's favorable impression suddenly increased. "Hello, senior, I want to go to the principal's office, can you tell me where it is?" "Let me take you there, you're so cute," Cedric rubbed Harry's head and smiled proudly. He held Harry's hand and put his school uniform jacket on him. "Be careful not to get cold." Harry tightened his clothes, feeling a little surprised as to why this person he had just met was so nice and so familiar to him. It was noon, and the area around the school infirmary was quiet. Harry did not ask Cedric why he came here, and Cedric did not ask Harry why he went to the principal's office. They met in another time and space, and seemed to have the same tacit understanding, walking together in silence. The victim of the First War was standing in the Hogwarts castle at this moment, strolling in the corridor. The midday sun shone briefly on the ground, without favoring the visitor from another time and space. Cedric walked slowly, holding the hand of his young savior, towards his own glorious life. "It's here, Harry, go in, the password is cockroach pile." Cedric sent Harry to the door of the principal's office. Harry said goodbye to him, turned around to look at the familiar gate and shouted cockroach pile. The stone lion reluctantly jumped to the side, revealing the spiral staircase inside. Harry slowly walked up the stairs. Cedric looked at Harry's back quietly, his eyes seemed to contain thousands of words, but in the end he just pursed his lips, and disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if he had never come to the world. In the office, Dumbledore paused while eating lunch when he heard a strange power fluctuation outside the door. Then he had no time to think about these things. Looking at Harry who suddenly appeared at the door, he was a little surprised. "Why did this kid come?" Dumbledore asked Harry what he wanted to talk to him about. Harry didn't know how to start. What kind of task was this broken system? He and Dumbledore had only just met, so why did he always look for the headmaster whenever he had something to do? He secretly despised his own dependents. "Well, sir, I want to ask, when can I go back?" Harry suddenly had an idea. "My aunt and uncle must be very worried about me now." Dumbledore looked at Harry with satisfaction. "It would be great if there was a bond of family affection." "Harry, don't worry, I will tell your relatives. You should rest here and Madame Pomfrey will take care of you. Dumbledore invited Harry to have dinner with him, but Harry refused and left the office. After leaving the office, he started running. The air current around him blew his hair, revealing the conspicuous scar on his forehead. The eyes were bright green, the spirited boy had a firm aura, but the hospital gown he was wearing was a little conspicuous. This really attracted the students around him. Was it Harry Potter? Some people lowered their heads and saw the thin boy running. People started to exclaim. If you want to know why Harry is like this, you might as well ask this terrible system. Not only because of the time that was gradually decreasing, but also because of the new line of small words that followed the task. If the task failed, Malfoy's lifespan would be reduced by another third. If the task was successful, his IQ points would increase by 10. Harry looked at the new things that popped up in his mind with curiosity. This, what is this? Chapter 8. Panel. Name, Harry Potter. Age, 9 years old. Physical fitness, 30, out of 100, your body is not as healthy as a Muggle. Appearance, 76, out of 100, your face is the only thing that is acceptable. Soul strength, 75, out of 100, hard to rate, after 2 lives, this is rare. Intelligence level, 50, out of 100, not even passing, I really don't know how you became the savior. Magic power reserve, 20, full score? Understandable, after all, he is still a young wizard, not bad among his peers. Plant affinity, 5, out of 100, trust me, you have no talent for this. Alchemy talent, 70, full score is 100, you can light up this talent skill. Potions ability, 65, full score 100, slightly inherited from your mother. Combat skills, 70, full score is 100, not bad, after all, he was an auror in his previous life. The art of language, 3, out of 100, if you can keep silent, then don't speak. Flying ability, 80, out of 100, okay, barely enough to play in the professional league. Harry looked at the panel and felt a little embarrassed. Why was the speaking style so similar to Snape? Harry ran while looking, and with a bang, he bumped into someone. His flying hair fell on his forehead, covering the scar. Oh, sorry. Harry looked up and saw that he looked very familiar. Do you have a brother? Harry looked at the younger senior and asked rashly. The boy smiled good-naturedly, no, I'm an only child. What's your name? My name is Cedric. Harry was shocked, he even began to suspect that everything just now was an illusion. Let's go, Professor McGonagall is waiting for you, the person next to him began to call Cedric. Bye, kid. Harry listened blankly as the other Cedric said goodbye. Let's go, Malfoy said anxiously in his mind, accusing Harry of slacking off. Harry seemed to have just woken up from a dream and started running again. His small body nimbly dodged the students around him who wanted to find out what was going on. He asked Malfoy in his mind, what about the money? Harry felt embarrassed and scratched his head. When you leave Hogwarts and go to Hogsmeade, I know you have a way. Malfoy rolled his eyes. If it wasn't for his own life, he wouldn't have to expose the secret of the Malfoy family. Dumbledore was in the office, eating taffy, and asked Fawkes to follow Harry. Fawkes was a little reluctant, as he still needed to rest. He chirped, and suddenly flames appeared on his body, surrounding himself. Then it disappeared, leaving only some ashes underneath. Dumbledore was a little helpless, okay, each one has a worse temper than the other. At this moment, a golden-haired, imposing man suddenly appeared on a photo frame standing on the table. He looked greedily at Dumbledore in front of the table. Dumbledore felt a little embarrassed being stared at, and he immediately put the photo frame on the table. When Harry stood beside the fireplace in the elegant wizard clothing store with British pounds in his hand, he was still a little dazed. As far as he knew, this was a large wizard clothing store with branches in London and Paris. Was it also owned by Malfoy? How could there be British pounds in a wizard's store? He looked at the traceless stretch bag in his hand and fell into deep thought. Malfoy was very proud in his mind, this is a secret way of communication inherent to pure-blood families. It should not be used unless it is an emergency. If it wasn't for my lifespan being absorbed, I wouldn't have sued you, he emphasized again. As soon as Harry took the money, Lucius, who was far away in the manor, knew about it. What, you said the base in Hogsmeade has been activated. Lucius heard the report from his subordinates and fell into deep thought. This method was known only to the head of the family, and it was not used even when the Dark Lord was present. He just thought of Snape's sudden visit and felt that something was not simple. Who activated the secret contact point? And what did they do? The person who came was a child, probably Harry Potter, and he came to get some pounds. The man's voice became smaller and uncertain. Lucius was a little confused by this inexplicable operation. Harry Potter, are you crazy or am I crazy? Wasn't he clearly arranged in the Muggle world by that old bee? Apart from a few people close to him, who else could know about it? The man lowered his head and did not dare to answer. Lucius stroked the ring on his hand and fell into deep thought. When Harry sat on the hospital bed again, he carefully felt the changes in his body and fell into ecstasy. He felt his mind was extremely clear. Some points that he had not noticed before were now as conspicuous as an oil lamp in the dark. He could even successfully complete the brewing of a lucky potion under Snape's gaze and the spray of venom. Harry felt a little swell. He patiently analyzed his current situation. There was something strange in his mind, and he needed to be alert at all times, figure out the condition of his soul, and save some lives even though he had lost his memory. But the problem is that he doesn't even know who died. Fortunately, there is always a way out. Harry noticed that some of the people he met had special reactions in their hearts, which might be the people who had passed away. But even Dumbledore was gone, and Harry really couldn't think of anyone who could have caused him to die. Harry was troubled by the sudden and overwhelming problems, so he decided to go to sleep. Maybe it would be another beautiful day when he woke up. Ding! The host's mission 1 has not been completed, continue to absorb 1/3 of Malfoy's lifespan. This voice was like a bolt from the blue, piercing the two lazy people and disrupting their plans. The two men analyzed that this should be a long-term task. After all, there was no time limit. Besides, Dumbledore's trust was not something that a 10-year-old boy and a mentally handicapped head of the family could easily gain. Unexpectedly, the task was completed without following the basic law at all. Without any special opportunity, it is hard to imagine how this doubt can be dispelled. Malfoy in his mind was a little terrified, because he could clearly feel his vitality slowly draining away in his weak body. Looking at Harry outside who was still in a daze in his sleep, he could not help but speak with a faint cry in his voice, "Potter, no, Harry, please save me too, as I once wanted to save you." The proud Master Malfoy lowered his noble head for the first time, and he once again returned to the state of being in constant fear as a Death Eater under Voldemort. Harry was awakened by this nightmarish news. He felt uncomfortable. This was not his intention. Malfoy was not guilty of such a crime, let alone being implicated by him. The weak face was reflected in Harry's pupils. Looking at the lifeless face and the bloodless lips, as fragile as a freshly blown colorful bubble, colorful clouds are easily dispersed and glass is broken, his heart ached slightly. Harry made up his mind and walked towards the headmaster's office again. Chapter 9. Contract. In the headmaster's office, Dumbledore received a letter. The light yellow envelope was stamped with red ink. The pattern on it was a triangle with a circle in the middle and a horizontal line drawn inside. Dumbledore's heart sank. The wizarding world today could not stand another disturbance. What did Grindelwald mean by this? He opened the envelope and took out the letter. The handwriting on it came into view, still as flying as before. After reading the letter, Dumbledore probably understood. He made another prophecy, which mentioned a picture he saw. That seems to be the wizarding world of the future. Part of the world was shrouded in a faint curtain of light. The humans and wizards inside looked up at the sky vigilantly. The humans' cannons were aimed at the sky, and capable aurors were scattered at the edge of the curtain of light, with several people floating above it. In the middle is Dumbledore, and behind him is the rejuvenated Grindelwald. Around them are people in strange costumes, some look ethereal, some look extremely gorgeous. The person confronting them was a young man, who made everyone feel like they were facing a formidable enemy. They gripped their wands tightly and showed expressions of disbelief. The young man's face was hidden under the brim of his hat, and his whole body was emitting strong magical fluctuations, which were earth-shaking. It seemed that he could destroy the world with just one palm. He stretched out his left hand, and green flames kept leaping. Behind him was a group of people wearing black cloaks, and their powerful aura was not inferior to that of the Hogwarts professors who had taught for many years. Because of what he saw, Greenwood became blinded and he needed some medicinal herbs to heal his wounds. When Dumbledore saw this, he immediately realized that the future crisis in this world was not just Voldemort, and he was just a small part of it. This picture reveals too much information. Will the confidentiality law be broken in the future? There is another force that suddenly rises and has been hiding for many years, and even the leader. Dumbledore thinks of the savior who suddenly changed. Is all this related to him? If there was only one person who met the requirements, it would be Voldemort, or, his newly established trust in Harry began to waver again. He fell into deep thought. After a while, Harry came in. Dumbledore looked at the young savior with a sharp gaze that was enough to penetrate people's hearts. Harry did not shy away from the gaze that many adults could not bear to look at. Dumbledore's expression changed and he smiled, as if he was still the amiable headmaster. "Headmaster, you should have noticed that I am not the same Harry anymore," Harry said straight to the point, catching Dumbledore off guard. Harry looked at Dumbledore, who had not changed his expression, and calmed himself down before continuing. "Due to some restrictions, I can't explain everything to you right now." Dumbledore fell into deep thought. What kind of restrictions, and what kind of Harry is he? He smiled and looked affirmative, trying to encourage Harry to continue speaking, but deep down, he was still judging every word. Harry didn't hear the mission accomplished sound in his mind. "Isn't that enough?" Harry sighed and decided to up the ante. Malfoy saw the decision Harry made and hesitated to speak, even though he knew he was selfish to let others pay so much for him, let alone a person. But, after all, it was about his own life, so he stopped himself from blurting out the dissuasion. "I know, what I said is a little thin, but please believe me." Harry looked straight into Dumbledore's eyes, and his emerald green eyes were like a meteor, hitting the deep sea in Dumbledore's eyes, splashing some emotion. Dumbledore felt the sincerity, an honesty he had not seen in years, his heart laid out before his eyes. Harry signed the unbreakable contract with him, in the presence of a man, wearing a cloak, who was summoned from the portrait by Dumbledore. Dumbledore did not stop it, but he felt even more guilty. He just needed some real information to make sure that the savior was real and the key figure in the prophecy was still on his side. Harry looked at the man emitting black mist with curiosity. Dumbledore called him Jim and was very close to him. The portraits on the wall seemed to be used to it and ignored the stranger who appeared in the office. The wizarding world is about to be in turmoil, and it's not just a few dark wizards. In this office, Harry has gained the unprecedented absolute trust of a great wizard and the sworn loyalty of a pure-blood family head. Malfoy had seen many opportunistic people who signed soul contracts on themselves for the sake of others. He didn't believe that Harry didn't know what this meant. That year, only his mother and godfather came here for him. Stupid Harry, Malfoy felt the vitality flowing back into his body, with a little sparkle in the corners of his eyes. "Ding, congratulations to the host, you have completed Mission 1, Reward, Fusion of the original owner's soul." "What, the original owner? Isn't I the original owner?" Harry was a little confused. The system did not explain, it just continued. Malfoy returns to his original position, and the host's soul domain is reset to 0. A yellow light flashed, and Malfoy disappeared. At the same time, in Malfoy's manor, a platinum young master was sleeping. Suddenly, his eyes rolled, and then he suddenly opened his eyes and stared straight at the ceiling. Harry lay on the hospital bed, quietly integrating his soul, feeling his 5 senses gradually becoming clearer, and he could even see traces of magic flowing. As night fell, a few scattered stars hung on the dark blue velvet, and everything seemed so quiet. In a small house on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, Hagrid was taking care of his furry friend. In the fireplace next to him, the dancing flames made crackling sounds, and a dark shadow suddenly appeared. Hagrid noticed it and turned around to see that the wood was burning quietly. The big guy touched his head and said to himself, "What's going on? Is this my hallucination?" The next day, after Harry had rested, he had another cordial conversation with Dumbledore. Dumbledore had a comprehensive understanding of everything from the future that could be revealed to the spells that could be cast, to the assessment of Harry's own strength, which changed his plan. The savior has become a relatively mature person and has had another wonderful experience. Fortunately, the contract was signed, the prophecy was correct, and the ability was there. No matter how you look at it, the advantage is in my hands. Then improve your strength vigorously. Dumbledore stroked his beard, looked at the disheveled Harry under Moody's training, smiled and squinted his eyes, thinking that it seemed that his old friend could live a little longer. Otherwise, why not add alchemy into the mix? Should we add that person? Dumbledore paused as he stroked his beard, a little hesitant. Chapter 10. Ron. Harry wandered in the mysterious area in his mind, looking at the distance. Huge figures were vague, huge buildings blocked out the sun, and he himself seemed like an ant, trying to survive among the rushing elephants. Seeing a foot getting closer and closer, accompanied by a fierce hurricane and a foul smell, Harry closed his eyes in fear, full of despair. Ah, it was the same dream again. Harry suddenly jumped up from the bed, sweating and panting. Dobby, Harry called, and poof, a house elf appeared in Harry's bedroom. Dumbledore had kept him at Hogwarts and taught him over the years. Harry learned a lot from him, and his other teacher. When he mentioned this, his forehead was black. What kind of person is this? He is just an apprentice, not a weird person. Is it necessary to guard against him so strictly? The respected savior is called Dobby, what an honor it is. The elf at the side was very excited, his two big ears fluttering around. Stop, Dobby, Harry ordered helplessly, he was a little dazzled by what he saw. Speaking of Dobby, we have to mention Draco, who is now raised in the Malfoy family. Talking about this, Harry is now full of smiles. In fact, the little dragon is still easy to get along with. It was he who gave this freedom-loving elf and his family to Harry, and Harry let Dobby work in the kitchen of Hogwarts. Thinking of Malfoy's proud and arrogant look at that time, Harry couldn't help but curl his lips. After Dobby came out, he completely followed the development of the previous life, but it was a little different. The elf used to advocate freedom, but the current one was unwilling to accept the clothes given by Harry, and even made some excessive actions to stop Harry from giving him freedom. Dobby stopped his trembling body, opened his huge eyes, looked at Harry, and clutched the small clothes on his body tightly with both hands. Dobby, could you please take me to platform 9 3/4? Could you please wait for me for a moment? Mr. Harry Potter used honorifics for an elf. Dobby was excited at first, his eyes became bigger than before, and he said, "It's my honor to serve Mr. Potter." He bowed in a strange way, imitating a human butler. There was a time when Harry sent Dobby to the human world to learn how to be a butler. He was a little confused by the system's task at the time, but he did it anyway. Harry shouted to himself, "Clean up," and in the blink of an eye, Harry's whole body became refreshed. Mr. Potter can cast spells without a wand. Dobby looked at the scene in front of him and seemed a little accustomed to it. After all, there are even more perverted ones. Thinking of this, Dobby puffed out his chest proudly. This is Dobby's master. Don't ask. If you ask, the system accidentally sucked Dobby in once. One person goes in every year. Really? London platform 9 3/4. Thick smoke and dust surrounded the entire train station. The crowd was looming inside, and the fiery red front of the train was hidden in the fog, like a huge monster. There was a lot of noise all around, including the sound of children crying and adults scolding them harshly. There were also people in strange clothes who ran straight into a pillar. There was a Muggle nearby. He saw it, touched his daughter who was squatting at his feet and concentrating on playing with toys, and just when he was about to point his camera at this strange sight, he found a huge eye pointed at him. Oblivion is emptiness. The Muggle's eyes shook, he put down the camera, and staggered away. The child squatting beside him discovered that his father was suddenly missing and started crying. The sharp sound immediately attracted some people around, and a well-dressed lady holding a handkerchief reached out and picked up the girl. Mrs. Velis, who was not far away, accidentally saw the struggling girl and whispered, "Young people are just annoying." After saying that, he lowered his head and touched Ron. "Wait a minute, watch how your brother passes, and then you follow him in." Ron nodded obediently. Behind them, the lady covered the little girl's mouth and nose with a handkerchief and put her face against her chest, pretending to coax her. Gradually, the girl stopped moving and lay obediently on the woman's chest, as if she was lying on her mother's chest. The Auror next to her saw it and smiled indifferently, wondering if the couple had a quarrel. Harry sat in the carriage, looking out the window quietly, somewhat resenting Dumbledore. Really, why did he have to make a special trip out of here? He already lived in Hogwarts. Meeting new friends? He thought of Ron and Hermione and felt a little sad. Why? In his memory, there was neither death nor betrayal, and they lived well together until the end of the war. As for the meeting, since he was sent by Uncle Vernon in his previous life, now, because a long time has passed, too many details have been forgotten, not to mention when they arrived at the train station and which carriage they sat in. At this moment, the door of the carriage was suddenly opened, and a young master with platinum blonde hair pushed the door open, followed by a bodyguard with short and hard hair, a huge build, and arms like a gorilla, which looked very clumsy. "You're here." Harry saw Malfoy, his eyes filled with smiles. Yet, Draco restrained the joy on his face, nodded reservedly, and sat down next to Harry. "Well, have you met your stupid Velis, and the future Minister of Magic?" Malfoy said casually. Goyle turned his head slowly. "Minister of Magic, what are they talking about?" Harry was a little worried. The carriage was full, and Draco was here, so he wondered if he would come in. So he opened his mouth but didn't say anything. The carriage fell into silence. At the end of the train, Ron, carrying his heavy luggage, finally found a carriage. There was only a little wizard in it. He went in with his suitcase and said hello. The little wizard looked at Ron, nodded, and immediately fell silent. The atmosphere was a little awkward. Ron walked beside the window, quietly watching the scenery passing by. Trains sped past among the green mountains and clear waters, birds flew into the forest, and the vastness of the world made people feel refreshed. Ron was lost in thought at this moment. He was a man from another world and had watched the Harry Potter film series before. However, due to the long time, he could not remember the details very clearly. He only knew that Harry's side won in the end and, yes, there were also Horcruxes and so on. Chapter 11. Pastry. He travelled through time when he was 9 years old. At the beginning, he was very excited. He became one of the protagonists and could get close to the savior. He could cast magic and become someone he never dared to imagine in his previous life. However, when he thought about the adventures he had experienced, it was fine to watch from the sidelines, but it would be better to forget about experiencing them himself. He was not very experienced, so how about being assigned to Hufflepuff, Ron thought secretly. Ron learned from his brother who went to school at Hogwarts that Harry Potter had come to Hogwarts when he was 9 years old and had his own room in the castle. This was different from what he saw in the movies. Ron thought carefully, could it be a fan fiction? The little wizard opposite saw that Ron had turned into a sculpture, with only the rising and falling chest to prove that he was a living person, and he became curious. He coughed lightly twice and ignored it. "Humph," the young wizard raised his voice, but there was no response from the other side. He rolled his eyes gracefully and continued to read his book. After a long time, Ron seemed to react, and the young wizard's eyes lit up, thinking that he finally saw him. Unexpectedly, Ron turned around and walked out, heading towards where the crowd was gathered. Savior, if he was assigned to Hufflepuff, there would be no chance for close contact. Ron walked over to Harry. Here, Harry looked at the little wizard outside the door and felt a headache. He didn't remember that in his previous life, there were so many people coming to see him. Who was so talkative? Draco next to him sneered, "Wow, our savior is still so popular." He looked at the current savior carefully. The experiences of two worlds gave Harry some unusual temperament. In addition, he once absorbed his own soul. Thinking of this, Malfoy blushed, making Harry the most eye-catching guy in the crowd. It was a world of difference from the original world. He secretly curled his lips. At this moment, there was a sudden commotion among the crowd. It turned out that the class leader started to chase people away. The crowd gradually dispersed, and Harry breathed a sigh of relief, feeling a little embarrassed. At this time, among the sparse crowd, the red-haired Velis was so conspicuous. The two looked at each other, Ron smiled embarrassedly, and Harry nodded politely. Harry looked at Ron's ruthless back and felt a little lost. After all, he had been with Ron for more than 10 years. But when he thought that Ron would also go to Gryffindor and live in the same dormitory with him, he felt much better. On the way back, Ron secretly regretted that the damn movie had misled him. No one said that this savior was so good. Thinking of the person who played the corpse in his previous life, Ron's face showed a constipated expression. At the back, two red-haired heads huddled together, as if discussing something. "Sorry to bother you, have you seen Neville's toad?" A little girl pushed open the carriage door unceremoniously, her eyes widened in an instant, revealing a look of shock. Looking at Harry who had lifted his hair because the carriage was too hot, Hermione said sheepishly, "I was wondering why so many people were crowded here just now. Is it really you? I know everything about you, of course, I bought a few extra reference books, Modern History of Magic, The Rise and Fall of Dark Magic, and Important Magical Events in the 20th Century. You are mentioned in these books." Harry smiled happily, he finally encountered something similar to his previous life. It seemed that things were not too off track. He thought about Ron just now. He felt so strange. Could it be because they were not sitting in the same box, so he was not familiar with him? He frowned in distress. Seeing this scene, Hermione's face, which had just blushed, immediately became normal again. Draco watched this scene, folded his arms, crossed his legs, and looked at the little witch at the door, who subconsciously ignored him with a forced smile. Ahem, Hermione's eyes moved to Malfoy, and she realized that there was someone sitting here. Excuse me, who are you? Hermione asked. Draco Malfoy, the young master raised his head proudly. Buzz, accompanied by the long whistle of the train, the same people began to communicate differently. First-year students, come over here, the 3-meter-tall Hagrid, wearing his fur coat and a unicorn hair scarf, shouted loudly to the freshmen of this grade. Harry, Malfoy, and Goyle were put on a small boat, and later, Ron, Hermione and Neville were put together. Here, Hermione pointed at a small black spot on Ron's nose and said, "There's something on your nose." Black lines appeared on Ron's forehead and he looked a little embarrassed. As the ship swayed, he began to wipe his nose for no reason and ignored Hermione's subsequent kindness. Neville, who was standing next to them, seemed a little overwhelmed when watching the interaction between the two. He opened his eyes wide to see the dark spot in Hermione's mouth, but because the light was too dim, Neville gave up. 2 flowers bloom, 1 branch each. Harry looked at the Hogwarts that was so close to him and found some differences from his previous life. In the past, when he was in the 1st grade, he was still a little wizard with low magic power, and he could not see what was so special about this castle that had been passed down for many years. But now, as a 2nd-generation human, he opened his eyes and looked at this cradle that gave birth to most of the wizards in Britain. The world in his eyes was filled with dazzling light, and occasionally he could see some light flowing slowly, but he couldn't see it clearly at the moment. Congratulations to the host for getting a glimpse of the entire castle. Now I am issuing a mission to explore the traces of the flow of magic power in the castle and obtain half of the castle's authority. The mission period is 3 years, so please plan it reasonably. In my mind, the stoat was slumped in an armchair, surrounded by a small round table with a glass of juice and a few cakes on it. It revealed a cunningness that was totally inconsistent with the stoat's silly temperament, and its small eyes looked so shrewd. Looking at Potter, who suddenly appeared, the little ferret seemed to have expected it. It pointed in the air, and a large armchair appeared on the empty ground. Harry, please sit down. Harry sat down as he was told, picked up a piece of cake and was about to put it into his mouth. This is a specialty food of our tribe. You can't eat it now. Be careful of it exploding. The weasel took the thing from Potter's mouth. Harry curled his lips, looking a little disappointed. Ever since he first saw it, this thing had been particularly attractive. There was a voice constantly tempting him to snatch it away and eat it. Don't come in so often, the people outside are watching you. The ferret kicked Potter out. Then what's this mission about? Harry remembered why he came in. Think for yourself, the weasel only said. Harry came back to his senses and thought indignantly, this is my brain, why can't I make the decision myself? Just when he thought of this, his head hurt. Don't say bad things in front of me. Okay, Harry tried to clear his mind. Malfoy, who was standing by, saw that Harry was in a daze, with a thoughtful look in his eyes. Did he go into that place again? Chapter 12. Branching. As night falls, the towering castle gradually approaches, and it is brightly lit and bustling inside. A witch in a dark green robe stood at the gate, waiting for the arrival of the new students. She looked serious and meticulous, scanning the little wizards who were gradually gathering below, and hovered around Neville's cloak. The cloak strap was tied under his left ear, and Harry and Malfoy, who were standing very close to him. When the number of people stopped increasing, he cleared his throat and said, "Welcome to Hogwarts." Professor McGonagall said, "The start of term banquet is about to begin, but before you sit down in the dining hall, you must first determine which college you will be admitted to. Sorting is a very important ceremony, because during your time at school, the college is like your home in Hogwarts. You will attend classes with other students in the college, live in the college dormitory together, and spend your spare time together in the college common room. The names of the 4 houses are Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Each house has its own glorious history and has cultivated outstanding witches and wizards. You are here in Ho during your time at Hogwarts, your outstanding performance will earn your house extra points, while any violations will cause your house to lose points. At the end of the year, the house with the highest score will win the house cup, which is very high honor. I hope that no matter which college you are assigned to, you can bring glory to the college. In a few minutes, the sorting ceremony will be held in front of all the teachers and students of the school. I suggest that you tidy up and be energetic while waiting. Professor McGonagall's eyes fell on Neville again. She pursed her lips, turned around and left. At this time, the little wizards who had been quiet just now were in an uproar. I heard from my brother that the sorting ceremony requires passing through a giant monster. No, it's clearly to check the spells we know, and only when we reach a certain number will we be allowed in. But I don't know anything. Listening to the discussions of the little wizards around her, Hermione became a little nervous. She muttered to herself quietly, as if she was reciting something. Ron, who was standing by, saw this and found it somewhat amusing. Although he knew what he was going to face next, he didn't know about Hermione. What a serious little cutie. He seemed to understand why Ron liked Hermione in the end. Ron's ears turned red when he thought of this, and he turned his head and looked forward. Hermione felt someone was looking at her, so she looked around and saw nothing unusual, except for a little wizard in front of her with ears as red as apples. The door slowly opened, and warm yellow light slanted down from the crack in the door, illuminating the little wizard's face, while also presenting the scene inside the castle in his young and innocent eyes. The hall was brightly lit, with thousands of candles floating in the air. Below were 4 long dining tables covered with shiny tableware, and sitting at the tables were young boys and girls in wizard robes. Further away were powerful wizards in various costumes, and there were also milky white ghosts wandering around, causing the little wizards to exclaim in surprise. As you get closer, everything is within your sight: magic, wonder, mystery, danger. The door to the magic world is open to you and me. In front of the professor's dining table, there was a chair with a worn, patched hat on it, which had several cracks on it. Harry, hiding in the crowd, looked at this familiar scene, but he no longer felt the tension and uneasiness of his previous life. His thoughts drifted into the sky, thinking about the scenes of his previous life like a kaleidoscope, sometimes continuous, but more often in fragments, with no beginning and no end, appearing in his mind. Malfoy on the side seemed to sense something and held Harry's hand tightly, because he knew that this was the last time. This world does not allow the children of Death Eaters to become good friends with the Savior. The Death Eater forces lurking in the dark will not allow it. How should Malfoy explain after the Dark Lord returns? There is only one Snape, and any more will be considered disloyal. Dumbledore would not allow it either. Otherwise, how could he have met the Velez family in his previous life? When Harry didn't know much about the entire wizarding world and didn't even understand idioms like Merlin's socks, he sent a traitor from a pure-blood family to make first contact with them. The first impression that was planted was that Slytherin was a place where bad wizards gathered. Voldemort hiding in the dark is even more troublesome, and you never know when he will jump out and bite you. What's more, Malfoy remembered the thing in Harry's mind. There are too many variables. The best way is to try to maintain the development trend of the original world, so as to have the advantage of prophecy. Harry, Draco called out in his mind, and Harry at the side sensed it. What's wrong? It's okay, I was just calling you. Harry was a little helpless. Ever since Draco came out of his mind, he left some symptoms, such as their telepathy, and there was no one in the world closer to them. Draco was secretly proud at this moment, but soon his expression tensed and he drooped his eyelids to block out the turbulent waves in his heart. Hannah Abbott, the shabby hat, had finished singing the song it had composed while Harry was distracted. A little girl with blonde hair and 2 ponytails ran to the stool and sat on it. Hufflepuff, the hat called out. There was a warm cheer from the Hufflepuff table. The little girl blushed as she hurried to the table, her braids swinging back and forth. She found a random seat and sat down, surrounded by the Badgers. As the number of people decreased, the team gradually moved forward. Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor just like in her previous life. Harry shifted his gaze to Ron. The sorting was still going on above, and it seemed that Ron would be behind him. He nodded to Ron, and Ron nodded slightly. Apparently they were not very familiar with each other. Harry was a little frustrated because he and Malfoy were so close. Harry Potter, the surrounding tables started to make a commotion, everyone was talking. When Harry came forward, Cedric at the Hufflepuff table waved at him. Harry smiled and looked at him, blinking. At the same time, the Veles twins at the Gryffindor table tapped their plates at Harry with bright smiles. Harry's face flushed. During his years at Hogwarts, although he was busy with training and running around and had little time to take a closer look at the castle, he still made a few friends and got to know some people again. Thinking about this, Harry sat on the stool and put the sorting hat on his head. "Oh, Harry, no, you have to open your head to me," the sorting hat muttered in Harry's ear. "Don't waste your time, just do as we agreed, and sort me into Gryffindor." Harry was a little helpless, because this was not something he could decide, and the ferret in his head didn't like people snooping. After looking at it for a long time, Harry's head was still in this dead look, and the tip of the sorting hat drooped dejectedly. He should get used to it, right? After all, he had tried it many times in the headmaster's office. "Gryffindor," the sorting hat muttered softly. Ever since it inherited Gryffindor's wool, nothing could drive it crazy like this. "What?" Professor McGonagall didn't hear clearly. "Gryffindor," the sorting hat yelled. Dumbledore smiled with satisfaction while Snape's poker-like face twitched slightly, as if smiling. Thinking of Harry's intelligence and talent in potions in recent years, he had just found the shadow of Lily in Harry's eyes, but he didn't expect to be assigned to Gryffindor. Okay, it was Potter after all. There were gasps from the Gryffindor table, and everyone was clapping hard. "We have Potter!" The Veles twins threw away the hats they had put on their heads at some point, high-fived each other, Percy laughed out loud, and Sir Nicholas of Gryffindor happily put his head down and ran around. The Slytherin next to him was dead silent. Although Malfoy knew that this was something he and Potter had discussed beforehand, he was still a little unhappy. He stared coldly at Potter, who was walking towards the long table, wanting to express his anger, but unfortunately his ability only lasted for 1 minute a day. Just now, he saw that Potter was in a bad mood, so he used it. Poor Harry felt a chill on his back and thought it was the ghost. Chapter 13. Chat. Not many people paid attention to Ron's sorting, except his brothers. He walked towards Gryffindor amid a lot of noise. Percy came up to him, hugged him with his arms and whispered congratulations in his ear. The Veles twins came forward and took over the conversation. "Ron's baby." Fred smiled and put a white ring around Ron's neck, while George smiled with his arms folded. "This is a gift." Ron looked down and saw that it was clearly a smaller version of a toilet seat. Ron stared at his brothers with a forced smile. "Okay, stop teasing him." Percy felt a little embarrassed when he saw the look in Dumbledore's eyes. He poked George with his finger. After receiving the signal, George noticed the gazes of the students around him, shrugged helplessly, lowered his head and bit the toilet seat on Ron's neck. Harry was watching the battle from the side, and Hermione also opened her eyes wide. Are all wizards nowadays like this? It makes it a little difficult for her to fit in. Are they all so fierce? Although Ron was a little angry, he didn't want to let his brother lick the toilet. Just as the word "don't" came out of his mouth, before the words fell, there was a crack, and the white toilet seat was exposed to brown. A sweet smell came to his face, making Ron's head swell. It was chocolate. "What is this for?" He was a little amused and confused. Hermione let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, there were still normal people here. Dumbledore on the stage watched this scene with a smile, met Harry's eyes, winked at him, then took out his wand and cast a loud voice spell on his throat. "Welcome everyone to Hogwarts." Everyone's eyes shifted from the conspicuous pair of bags to Dumbledore's words. "I just have one thing to say, idiot, crybaby, scraps, screw, let's eat." The table suddenly became lively. Harry looked at the food that suddenly appeared, and then turned to look at Ron, who was sitting next to him. Yes, that's right, they were not originally sitting together, but Percy pulled Ron over. "Hi," Harry greeted Ron warmly, looking at the somewhat shy one. "Hello." Ron was a little overwhelmed. He didn't want to get so close to the savior, but the other party greeted him enthusiastically, so he didn't want to appear too abnormal. He picked up the barbecue on the table and started eating, trying to show that he was very hungry, and ate voraciously, so that he wouldn't have to deal with Harry's communication. Harry seemed to notice something, but said nothing. After so many years together, Ron was one of his closest people, and he was very familiar with his personality. Could it be the butterfly effect? Harry thought while eating, it shouldn't be possible. Why is Ron different? Harry still hadn't figured out what was going on until he followed the team back to the Gryffindor dormitory, sat on the bed, and watched Ron packing his things. Ron felt the gazes from behind him and thought to himself, not good. What's going on? Is he exposed? They were still like in their previous lives. Swordmaster Neville, he, Ron, and the blaster genius Seamus were assigned to the same dormitory. But Harry did not break this window paper. The four of them drank the drinks Harry brought from the Muggle world, got to know each other, and went to bed early because they were too tired. When they went to bed, Harry looked at Ron, who seemed to be asleep, raised his eyebrows, and lay down too. But he has to go to bed early, because he has to do something big tonight to solve the problem from the source. Silent all night. In the morning, at the long table in Gryffindor, Harry was drinking orange juice and looking at the timetable. The first class was Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class. He remembered that he was late at this time in his previous life. Harry left the table with the bread in his mouth. Ron looked at Harry's receding back and secretly breathed a sigh of relief. In the Transfiguration classroom, when Harry opened the door, there was only one person in the classroom, a small figure lying in the first row, with thick books piled up next to her, almost burying her. "Hi," Harry greeted Hermione and sat next to her. The little girl probably hadn't come back from the world of books yet, her eyes were a little confused, until a while later, her eyes focused and saw the handsome savior sitting next to her, her cheeks slightly reddened. As long as you understand this history, no one would be indifferent to the savior sitting next to them. "Hello," she greeted him, and seeing Harry's friendly attitude, she felt a little relieved and started talking. "My name is Hermione Granger," she stretched out her hands to Harry and said enthusiastically, "I left in a hurry that day and didn't have time to introduce myself. My parents are Muggles, so I'm worried that I may not be able to keep up with the school's teaching progress." The little girl seemed a little nervous. Seeing this situation, Harry hurried to comfort the slightly immature future Minister of Magic. It turned out that he was closer to Ron, and only later did he gradually become friends with Hermione. He had never thought that such a powerful person in the future would be so uneasy now. Harry felt that he had an obligation to help his friend solve his problems. The two of them, one of them listened attentively, and the other had a slight liking for him, so they chatted on. At this time, a kitten sneaked in through the door and looked at the two little wizards who had sat in the first row of the classroom early, with a satisfied expression. The hair on her ears moved slightly, and she listened attentively to the conversation between the two young wizards. When she heard the first-year students talking about how to practice anagomas, what was the patronus, and what kind of influence a person's soul and emotions had on spellcasting, Mag was greatly shocked, and she decided to test them. The kitten jumped onto the table and climbed up. At this moment, Hermione saw the kitten suddenly appear on the table and cried out in surprise. Just as she wanted to touch the kitten and stand up, Harry grabbed her hand and pressed her back to her seat. When Hermione looked a little strange, Harry walked up, bowed to the kitten, and said, "Hello, Professor McGonagall." Now, Professor McGonagall could no longer sit still. There was a flash of light, and she returned to her human form in the blink of an eye. How could she be discovered? There were still a lot of cats in the school. Learning from past experience, this time she specifically concealed the frames around her eyes and the color of her body when she transformed. Who would have thought that someone would see through it at a glance? Professor Cat lost some confidence in her transfiguration. She asked Harry curiously, "How did you see that?" Harry looked at Professor McGonagall. In his eyes, whether she was in human form or in the form of anagomas, the light on her body was so dazzling that he could not ignore it. At the same time, he is also particularly sensitive to the traces of magic flow in the surroundings, but this is something he definitely cannot talk about. In a flash, Harry made up an excuse to hide his ability. "You know, I've been at Hogwarts for quite a while, and sometimes when I was eating in the Great Hall, I heard some seniors talking about this." Professor Cat had no choice but to accept this explanation, but it also meant that she scared two fewer little wizards in this class. They reached an agreement and promised not to tell anyone about the matter after the other person came. Chapter 14. Tracking. Ron hid behind the door, secretly watching this scene with deep thought in his eyes. It was indeed different. The savior took the initiative to approach a Muggle who had just entered the wizarding world and had not yet shown any talent. Was he really just trying to make friends? Plus, he remembered that Harry secretly got up last night on the first day of school. Logically speaking, the Harry in this world had lived in Hogwarts for a long time, so it didn't make sense for him to do this. He secretly followed Harry and watched him and Quirrell, yes, the Quirrell who was possessed by Voldemort. Ron looked at the two people walking in the corridor together, as if they had known each other for a long time. He felt cold on his back and sweat ran down his face. What if the Savior and Voldemort were together? He didn't want Voldemort to rule the British wizarding world in the next few years. By then, his family would not be able to escape. Almost all of his family members were in the Order of the Phoenix organized by Dumbledore. But weren't Harry's parents killed by him? How could he live peacefully with this person? Could it be the Imperious Curse, the Polyjuice Potion, or the fragment of Voldemort in Harry's head awakening and swallowing up Harry's original consciousness? The more he thought about it, the more likely it was. Did Dumbledore just allow this to happen? Ron felt that his future was bleak. He decided to get closer to this savior, see where he stood, and find out the truth. As for Dumbledore, well, his current brain occlumency skills are not very good. It is better to stay away from these powerful wizards. Here, Harry looked at Quirrell, who was a head taller than him, with a handsome face but wearing a purple turban, like an Indian. Professor Quirrell next to him was a little nervous. After all, as soon as he arrived here, he was forced by a note to meet his mortal enemy in the middle of the night, away from the eyes and ears. The note said, "Hello, Mr. Voldemort, do you want the Philosopher's Stone? Meet at the door of the commemorative cup display room at midnight today." Quirrell sniffed and smelled a cool scent entering his head, making his confused mind a little clearer. Harry tilted his head slightly and glanced at Ron, who was following quietly behind him. He found it a little funny. After all, he was the first one to get into the condom so quickly. He came out tonight when everyone else in the dormitory was asleep. He wanted to test Ron, so he only added some water of life and death to the other two people to ensure that they would not suddenly wake up when he took action. If Ron was a normal little wizard, on the first day of school when he was still unfamiliar with everything and was so tired, he would have wanted to have a good rest. Even if he wanted to take risks, his actions were not in line with common sense. Harry deliberately increased the noise of his footsteps as he passed his bed. In the dim light, he could clearly see Ron's eyes moving slightly. At this time, if you are sleeping and dreaming, you should not follow him. If you are woken up by him and want to take risks, either go out alone or wake up and go out with him. If you don't want to take risks, you should sleep in bed. Secretly following a strange classmate, being so wary of him, and wanting to find out his whereabouts, this person and this style of behavior are not very similar to Ron in the previous world. Who could they be? Harry was a little sad. He didn't know if he would lose his good friend when he came back. But, that's not right. Didn't the Vélez family always follow Dumbledore? Could it be that Dumbledore still had doubts about him? His system didn't give any hints. Besides, it was not in line with the White Lord's style to let such a little wizard do this. Even Voldemort started to exploit child labor when Malfoy was in the 5th grade. Although Harry was brainstorming, he did not dare to act carelessly. He turned to Quirrell and said, "Professor, let's go to your office." Quirrell's temperament suddenly changed, and his whole body became mysterious. The back that had just bent stopped again. He smiled and suddenly turned around to look at the black corridor behind him. It was silent and no one was there. A look of doubt appeared on his face, but there was still no movement. Quirrell lowered his head and whispered in Harry's ear, "Okay," and then he rubbed Harry's head affectionately, half forcing him, half threatening him. He held Harry's wand against his head and walked towards his office. The two figures were close together, like their souls. Ron, who was standing behind him, had just seen two people walking together very closely. Due to the dim light, he did not notice that Quirrell's wand was against Harry's neck. Harry's expression remained unchanged, and he looked particularly relaxed. He showed a comfortable expression and smiled at the cautious professor. At this moment, a meow suddenly came from the front, followed by Filch's voice, "Let me see which student is not sleeping in the middle of the night. Once I catch him, I will deduct heavy points from your school." His face appeared in the dim light. He was not a very kind person. He had been a squib for many years, but now he worked as an administrator in the largest wizarding school in the UK. This gap has wiped out his few good attitudes. After Harry and the other two in front saw this, Harry turned to look at Quirrell with a look of watching a good show, wanting to see what he would do. Quirrell waved his wand. "Oh, it's the disillusionment charm, but that's not enough." Ron, who was behind, saw this, cursed in a low voice, turned around and ran. Nonsense, what else was he waiting for? He didn't want to be famous at school on the first day, so he should leave this method to his brother. As for Harry, he would pray for him. In short, saving his life was the most important thing. Ron's few remaining consciences kicked in. Forget it, he couldn't just watch Harry fall into danger. What if he was controlled by Voldemort? What if it was due to his own butterfly effect? He turned around and ran to the office on the 8th floor, panting, as if he was racing against death. Filch came over, and Mrs. Norris was circling around their feet. She had only used the disillusionment charm, but the kitten could not touch them. However, this period of time also bought some time for Ron to leave. Harry looked at this scene in surprise. He wanted to learn this thing, and thinking about the next plan, he felt that this idea could be realized. They also walked to Quirrell's office. It was already midnight and the whole castle was in a deep sleep. Only the murals on the wall and the occasional person walking around could be seen. Quirrell's office exuded a charming smell of garlic. Harry wrinkled his nose in disgust. But, fortunately, he brought some catnip in advance. Yes, that's right, otherwise how could he attract the kitten and ensure Ron's safety at the same time? Voldemort was not a kind person. He would not survive if he found out that someone saw him making a deal with the Savior on the first day of school. Before Harry went out, he specifically saw Filch wandering around on the Marauders map. He only needed to make sure Ron followed him, and there was no need to do anything else. Chapter 15. Deception. After Quirrell entered the office, he sat on the chair. He crossed his hands and placed them on the table. He looked at Harry Potter, who was standing in a very relaxed posture. He felt ignored, which made him a little annoyed. But thinking about the note he received tonight, he looked at the 11-year-old boy in front of him with scrutiny. "Did you give me the note today? What do you know about it?" Quirrell spoke first tentatively. It was a letter of admiration from a little boy with black hair. At that time, in the public eye, Dumbledore was also looking at him. He couldn't do anything and could only disguise himself as an ordinary professor. However, he didn't expect that his true identity would be exposed as soon as he arrived. "I know you are Voldemort, but I am here to cooperate with you," Harry said. "I am handing the Philosopher's Stone to you today as a token of my sincerity." He smiled at Quirrell. In order to increase credibility, he revealed some things to Voldemort. "My mother's protective magic was given by Dumbledore. He used my mother to kill you." He had noticed that something was wrong with Peter a long time ago, but he felt that this incident would help kill you, so he acquiesced and went with the flow. Harry lowered his head and took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes with his hands. His eyes immediately turned red. He silently complained in his heart, "Wow, this mint taste is so sour." When he raised his head, his face was already covered in tears, his eyes were red, and his body was trembling slightly, as if he had been enduring for a long time and finally got to vent today. Quirrell was a little shocked. "Quick, let me out." Quirrell untied his turban tremblingly, and turned his back to Harry. The distorted face on the back of his head looked closely at this savior who was so elusive to him. "How do you know all this?" Voldemort was a little skeptical, but he had already believed it for the most part. In his heart, Dumbledore was not at all like what people said he was. He was an extremely hypocritical person. "Even so, I still killed your parents. Why did you ask me to cooperate with you?" Voldemort lost his patience. He wanted to know the truth of the matter. "Look into my eyes," Voldemort commanded. Harry raised his head obediently, and his emerald green eyes made Voldemort a little dazed for a moment. He had seen them on a mother more than 10 years ago. Harry knew that Voldemort would never believe him, and he shouted in his mind, "Hurry up, show us a movie." The ferret was a little impatient, but there was nothing he could do, as Harry had been bothering him for a long time about this matter. Voldemort saw in Harry's mind a scene similar to his childhood, being bullied, insulted, and rising up in resistance. The difference was that Harry was not capable enough and was continued to be suppressed. Until one day, he met his brother Tom, who would comfort him, bring him delicious food, and introduce him to things in the wizarding world. They often met on the school playground, watching the sunset and eating fried chicken together. The golden red glow shone on the two of them, making them look exceptionally harmonious. Voldemort opened his eyes wide at this so-called brother Tom. Wasn't this his younger self, probably in the 5th grade? He looked at his former self in surprise, and he had fooled this kid so much that he couldn't understand anything. In his words, he was a hero whose revolution failed, and Dumbledore was a stumbling block that hindered the progress of the wizarding world. As for that night, he wanted to invite the Potters to join him in his great cause, but because he had seen Dumbledore being plotted against once before, he was controlled by this powerful wizard with the Imperious Curse, which ruined his reputation and caused him to break up with his current pure-blood family. Dumbledore was ruthless and cruel. In order to stop his career, he even sent his own subordinates to Azkaban to take the blame. The person who blew up the street was Peter, but they sent the loyal Black in because they wanted to seize his family's property to bribe the other pure-blood families. Later, he was framed by Dumbledore and lost his body, but Dumbledore thought he was dead. He used his reputation and power to change the truth of the matter and ruined his reputation in the wizarding world. Those who knew the truth and were unwilling to surrender were sent to Azkaban by him. When Voldemort saw this, he was slightly stunned. He only knew today that his subordinates had such loyal character. He was really good at making up stories. If he hadn't experienced it himself, he would have believed it. But when he thought that this should be the Horcrux he made when he was young, he was not surprised. Well done. Later, in order to avoid facing his few consciences, Dumbledore sent Harry to the Muggle world, but he did not expect that Uncle Tom would come and tell him the truth. However, when he was 9 years old, Uncle Tom was discovered by Dumbledore. In order to protect Harry, he was killed by Dumbledore. Harry was also injured and a magical riot broke out. In order to achieve his own goals, Dumbledore also tampered with the truth in Harry's mind, making him hate a hero who wanted to lead the wizarding world to light. But a few days ago, he met Uncle Tom again. While Dumbledore was inviting the next professor, Uncle Tom restored Harry's memory, told him to help the hero return, and asked him to steal the Philosopher's Stone. Voldemort looked at the boy who seemed to hate Dumbledore and laughed. He felt that this was the best news he had heard in the past few years. Although he was puzzled about how the Horcrux came out, it didn't matter now. The Philosopher's Stone was right in front of him. If Dumbledore was killed by the child he personally protected, it would be a great choice. His eyes softened, and he patted Harry's shoulder gently with a look of pity, saying, "What your Uncle Tom said is true. Back then, your parents and I were good friends. In order to avoid Dumbledore's persecution, they set up a Fidelius charm for their house, and I was the secret keeper. Dumbledore took advantage of this and killed your parents. It is indeed my responsibility." Harry looked at the twisted face trying to show a sad expression, and almost couldn't help laughing. Things had come to the most critical moment. Harry stabilized his mentality, looking at Voldemort with admiration, as if he was the closest person to Harry in the world. "What about the Philosopher's Stone?" Voldemort got to the point. "How did you bring it here?" Harry didn't say anything. He just looked at the man in front of him quietly. Then he lowered his head and took out a stone from his pocket. Voldemort's eyes were firmly caught by the stone, and a greedy look appeared in his eyes. However, the strange development of this matter made him a little hesitant. How come someone delivered something to him as soon as he arrived? Can the things in Harry Potter's head be trusted? Could it be that Dumbledore was testing him with this? Voldemort was a little hesitant. At the same time, he stood up and slowly walked towards Harry. No matter whether it was a trap or not, the Philosopher's Stone was real. After all, he could still escape from Dumbledore's attack. With the addition of the Savior, he smiled coldly when he thought of this. Voldemort looked at Harry's dull appearance due to excessive legilimency and frowned with some disdain. The magician's stone flies did not move. "Well, it seems that I still have to hold it in my hand." While being cautious, he asked Harry to put the Philosopher's Stone on the table. What happened just now needed to be confirmed, and he couldn't fully trust Harry yet. Everything went so smoothly. Harry slowly approached. Voldemort saw that the task was accomplished. He leaned forward slightly with a hint of fanaticism in his eyes. He was not at all wary of Harry's approach. Harry frantically called out to the system in his mind, "When can I touch him?" "When?" The stoat rolled his eyes but continued to report truthfully. 3, 2, 1, as the two get closer and closer, the distance between them is within reach. Harry touched Voldemort's hands, there was a flash of golden light, and he disappeared. At the same time, a guest also came into Harry's mind. Chapter 16. Silver Needle. Harry wiped his hands gently with the handkerchief in his pocket, reached out and took the stone back from the table, wrapped it in the handkerchief, and put it back in his pocket. He opened the door gently and looked at the silence in the corridor. He walked away quietly, his emerald eyes filled with a hint of relief and smile after a successful mission. The biggest trouble in the wizarding world has been resolved. On this unknown night, the prisoners of Azkaban are still waiting, and some people from pure-blood families are still waiting for the wizarding world to be overturned again. It will not be as tragic as the previous life. He just needs to absorb Voldemort's soul. But, is it really that simple? Harry's face was hidden in the darkness. The moonlight was like a silk thread, gently draped behind the lonely traveler, and a portrait in the corridor secretly opened its eyes, and its eyeballs rolled around. Ron's thoughts returned to the classroom. There were already some voices in the back, chattering with innocence and ignorance of the world. He sighed, a little envious, and Ron walked into the classroom and sat next to Harry. At the same time, a kitten jumped onto the table. The two people next to it looked gloating. When Ron saw it out of the corner of his eye, he roughly understood the identity of the kitten. Although he knew that he should not be exposed too much, the experience of last night had almost shaken him off. Not long after he ran away, he met Dumbledore. The headmaster did not say anything, but just glanced at him with his eyes that seemed to see through everything, and Ron felt that he had been exposed. Dumbledore asked him to follow, and he saw Harry and Quirrell enter the room with his own eyes. Then after a while, Harry came out by himself. Then Dumbledore asked him to go back by himself, and he went into the office himself. Ron didn't know what happened afterwards, but fortunately, until now, the school was still calm, which made him feel a little relieved. Ron pretended to be completely clueless, and then gently touched the kitten. The kitten was stimulated, and suddenly arched its body and its fur stood up. Harry looked at him with admiration, which made him feel very useful. How could someone who dared to touch a tiger's whiskers not be called a warrior? Kitty suddenly turned into Professor McGonagall. She looked at the daring child in shock, but she felt guilty. After all, she was the one who wanted to test him, so she couldn't blame the student. Professor McGonagall moved her mouth, but didn't say anything in the end. She didn't turn back into a kitten, but sat upright on the podium and opened her book. At this time, Ron pretended to be frightened and apologized to Professor McGonagall tremblingly, but in his heart he was very happy. Professor Meow Meow was so nice. At this time, Harry patted Ron and gave him a thumbs up under the table. Hermione on the side was full of appreciation and envy. She wished she could pretend to be ignorant and pet the little cat. The slightly awkward atmosphere between the three of them was slightly resolved. The classroom seemed to be packed with people all of a sudden, with students from the two colleges sitting clearly separated. Transfiguration is the most complex and dangerous spell you have in your classes at Hogwarts. Anyone who tries to cause trouble in my class will be asked to leave and never come back. I warned you. Professor McGonagall said seriously, and then, in the fearful eyes of the little wizards, she turned the table on the podium into a grunting pig. Harry and the other two who were closest to it could really feel the heat and stench coming from the animal's body. The pig's head kept shaking, and its ears occasionally trembled. Hermione wrinkled her nose in disgust. The little wizards sitting in the classroom soon exclaimed in surprise. The professor looked at the scene in front of her with satisfaction. Then she continued to explain the main points of the class, and with a wave of her hand, she turned the newborn pig back into a dead object. Harry looked at the flow of magic power greedily. He only needed to watch it once more to learn this profound spell. In his eyes, lights of different colors flowed in different directions. What was this? Harry felt that it looked familiar. Wasn't this the magical text he saw in his mind at the beginning? He pondered carefully, trying to find the common point among them. Was it the pattern of colors, or the flowing patterns, or was it really a rune? The next task is to turn a match into a silver needle. The spell is Transfiguration 1. Professor McGonagall knocked on the blackboard to remind the students to pay attention. Hermione listened attentively, her hands on the table, her head following Professor McGonagall's key points of the lecture, and she raised her hand from time to time to ask the teacher questions. Harry, who was standing by, felt helpless when he saw this scene. It had been a long time since he remembered the classes in his previous life. He was only deeply impressed by Hermione's Miss Know-It-All. In addition, the ferret had tugged at his soul, so he had very few useful memories. Did she do the same thing in her previous life? Harry poked Ron habitually with his elbow, motioning him to look at Hermione on the right, as if they were still good friends, not new classmates they had just met. Ron felt a little uncomfortable. He also saw the performance of the little girl next to him. He had had enough of the difficult life in China in his previous life, and wanted to lie down in this life. But I didn't expect there was a king of rolls around. What is this called? Murphy's Law. Professor McGonagall handed the needle down. Harry looked at the silver needle in front of him, wondering whether he should transform immediately or wait a while. After all, pretending not to know how to do it was tiring. Harry thought about his last life and felt that things had changed. When he first came to this world, he brought the magic power of his previous life with him. He was already proficient in wandless spell casting, and he came to school here just to follow the crowd, without any special ideas. Transfiguration, Harry decided to try it out first, and the corresponding image emerged in his mind. The silver needle body was engraved with a vine, which was emerald green, and there were a few leaves, just wrapped around the tip of the needle. The match in front of him began to slowly change according to Harry's wishes until it was completely transformed, with unusual smoothness. At this time, Harry looked at the several little wizards around him. Well, they were working very hard. Ron next to him was chanting spells vigorously, his face flushed red, like a lion with its fur standing on end. Then a few drops of sweat flowed from his forehead onto his freckles, and finally dripped onto his collar, drawing dark spots. He finally couldn't help but smile, revealing a mouthful of big white teeth. Ron, who was standing next to him, was a little annoyed and angry. He glared at Harry fiercely. For the first time, he felt that this savior was indebted to him. Harry covered his mouth tactfully, but the gloating look in his eyes eventually leaked out and rushed to Ron's nose, forcing him to react. Ron couldn't help it, he stretched out his evil hands and began to reach for Harry's armpits. Before Ron realized it, he had gradually lost his vigilance against the savior. Ha 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 ha, Harry laughed as he dodged and accidentally bumped into Hermione. Hermione looked at the two fighting boys angrily, and felt even more uncomfortable when she saw the exquisite silver needle on Harry's desk. Before she could start speaking, Professor McGonagall heard a sound at the back of the classroom that was inconsistent with the sound of the spell. She became a little angry, and strode towards where Harry and the other two were. When she was about to attack, her eye was caught by the silver needle on the table, and some of her anger was extinguished. Mr. Harry Potter has successfully conjured a beautiful silver needle. Gryffindor gets 10 points, said Professor McGonagall, looking extremely happy. Many young wizards still cannot turn a match into a complete silver needle by the end of the school year. Gryffindor has such a person, and it seems that this year's House Cup will no longer belong to Slytherin. Professor McGonagall is very excited. She held up the silver needle that Harry had conjured up high, and the little wizards raised their heads and looked at the silver needle in amazement. Seamus Finnegan was sitting behind Harry. He looked at the scene with a little frustration and annoyance, waving his wand vigorously. Why couldn't he do it? Harry listened to the sounds around him, his cheeks slightly red, but at this moment, a bad premonition swept over his body, and Professor McGonagall also discovered something. Armor protect you, the two shouted. Chapter 17. Note. When Seamus cast a transfiguration spell, he actually exploded. His hair had changed from brown to burnt brown, standing on end. His face was dark, and he looked like a white man with the demeanor of a black man. He exhaled lightly, as if he had eaten charcoal. The little wizards nearby all changed their shock and fear into laughter when they saw this scene. There is no doubt that Seamus has become famous, the little prince of explosion, and he deserves the title. Well, no wonder he was asked to blow up the bridge in the final battle of Hogwarts. It really made the best use of it. Although he protected the classmates around him, Harry's face became even uglier, because at this moment, Malfoy's voice suddenly appeared in his mind. Yesterday, he asked Malfoy to lose the note to Quirrell in the middle of the journey. Harry's hair stood on end, his hands trembled slightly, and in just a short moment, cold sweat covered his entire body. If Voldemort knew his trump card and disrupted the development of his previous life, he didn't know what the world would become. Why did Malfoy throw away the note? It was obvious that he was under system control and would not do anything to harm Harry mentally. Moreover, during the past few years of getting along with him, he could feel his sincerity. Professor McGonagall noticed that something was wrong with Harry and thought that the young wizard had used too much magic. She asked Ron, who was beside Harry, to help Harry go to Madame Pomfrey's school infirmary for a checkup. Harry didn't refuse, he knew he wouldn't be able to teach in this situation. The young wizards behind were talking about it, saying that he was truly worthy of being the savior. In this situation, he could actually cast a spell that most third graders were unable to cast. Professor McGonagall felt a little distressed and exempted Harry from the transfiguration homework. Ron, who was standing next to him, looked at the trembling Harry with worry, and he helped Harry walk out of the classroom step by step. At this time, Harry held Ron's hand and took him to a secluded place with a serious look. Ron also felt the solemn atmosphere. Harry said, "Let's go to Dumbledore's office on the 8th floor first. I have something to talk to the headmaster about. Do you want to go back to the classroom first, or come with me? Ron looked at Harry's current state and was a little worried. Besides, who would be able to attend class in a hurry? Unless they were the top students. He smiled and said, I'll go with you. Even though he had just been exposed in front of Dumbledore last night, he still wanted to accompany Harry. At that moment, Harry chose to use a spell to protect them all. Ron seemed to have come to the magical world for the first time and felt the danger of magic. When he heard the sound, he seemed to have just recovered from the peaceful era in his previous life. Harry seemed to see Ron from his previous life. He smiled, patted Ron on the shoulder, took his hand and ran quickly to the 8th floor. In front of the stone beast in the principal's office, Ron was panting with exhaustion. He looked at Harry with admiration, but his face was slightly red. Could this be the legendary savior? His physical fitness was so strong. Lemon sherbet, cockroach pile. Harry tried hard to search his mind for the name of the candy that might be the password to the headmaster's office. If he had known, he would have carried a list of Honeydukes candies in his pocket at all times. Harry was a little exasperated at this time. Ron, who was standing next to him, looked at Harry's face which was gradually darkening, and shrank to the side without saying a word. At this time, Dumbledore came from behind, walking slowly with a smile on his face, as if something great had happened. Harry looked at Dumbledore in front of him and felt like the eunuch was anxious instead of the emperor. Why should I be in a hurry for something like saving the world? Harry felt a little regretful. Even if the sky fell, Dumbledore was still there to hold it up. After spending several years together, Harry had long lost the respect he had for the headmaster in his previous life, because who would be such a headmaster? When Harry was undergoing Moody's devilish training, he was watching with a smile on his face. From time to time, he would pull out a cockroach from his pocket and bite it hard. The black chocolate crumb stuck to his white beard. It was as if Harry was meeting this candy-loving old naughty boy for the first time. From time to time, I would test him, test his thoughts on wizards and muggles, test his attitude towards Hogwarts, test whether he agreed with that teacher's ideas, and test whether he had any ideas about unifying the wizarding world. Even though he wanted to control his every move so much, he still said that he trusted Harry very much. So who was the one who secretly followed him last night? Harry knew that Dumbledore was behind Ron, so he should also know about Professor Quirrell's sudden disappearance. At this moment, Harry suddenly realized something that he had not considered before. How should he explain Voldemort's sudden disappearance to this suspicious old professor? But he couldn't care less about these things at this moment, because he was not sure that the soul he absorbed last night was Voldemort. He decided to ask Dumbledore himself. But Ron, who was standing next to him, suddenly realized that there was another person next to him, but Harry felt that Ron was not suitable to listen to this matter at this time, and the fewer people who knew about this matter, the better. Dumbledore seemed to see what Harry was thinking at the moment. No, he saw it. What kind of headmaster would use legilimency on students at any time? Although the deep thoughts were protected by the ferret, the shallow thoughts were clearly visible under Dumbledore's scrutiny. Harry's forehead was now full of black lines. Dumbledore smiled and said, Ron, thank you for sending Harry here. I remember this class's transfiguration, otherwise you should go to class first, we have something to talk about. Ron actually didn't want to stay here for a long time, and he was a little scared when he saw Dumbledore's smiling expression. Following the principle of a friend's death is better than my own, Ron hugged Harry, turned around, and walked away from their sight. Dumbledore said, young people nowadays have great physical strength. He also noticed Ron's inexplicable awe of him. No, it wasn't inexplicable. Dumbledore narrowed his eyes because he found something very interesting from Ron's mind yesterday. But don't be in a hurry, no one wants to figure out everything, there are many unknown things in the world. He also holds a respectful mentality and allows these things to happen and exist, such as the savior in front of him. Harry couldn't wait any longer. He said, you were able to confirm at the dinner table yesterday whether Professor Quirrell had Voldemort attached to him. Dumbledore was not surprised at all when he heard this question. He simply replied, I'm sure. What about last night? Harry continued to ask, when you were following me, could you be sure whether Professor Quirrell in front of you still had Voldemort? Dumbledore nodded. Harry heaved a sigh of relief, and sank his consciousness back into his own mind. He walked to the glass wall and looked at Quirrell sleeping in his head. He decided that it was time to wake him up. Harry did not explain why he suddenly asked these questions, and Dumbledore did not intend to explore. This was the way they had been getting along for the past few years. Ever since Harry brought the house elf Dobby to Dumbledore, wanting him to adopt Dobby and have him work in the Hogwarts kitchen just like in his previous life, Dobby suddenly disappeared from their sight. Then it came to Harry's mind, and he knew that in front of Dumbledore, he had been looked at so thoroughly that not even his underwear was left. Chapter 18. Absorption. Here, when Harry left the office, he wanted a quiet place to look at the situation of Professor Quirrell in his mind, and at this time he thought of the room of requirement. It had not been burnt down by the fire in the previous life. It was indeed a good place to go. What? Burnt down by the fire? Harry realized that his idea was wrong. Was the room of requirement burned down? Was this another memory he had lost? Harry did not go into it any further. The important thing now was to investigate Voldemort's situation. Besides, he had no classes today, so he could study his own affairs. On the 8th floor, Harry stood in front of the tapestry, thinking hard, I want a place to study ancient alchemy. Not long after, a door suddenly appeared in front of him, a dark brown door with a copper handle on it, rusty, ancient and mysterious. Harry was a little frightened by this quaint gate. In his previous life, he seemed to have seen this before when he went to the Himalayas. Later, he got a golden pendant from it. Harry couldn't remember when he went there, but it seemed that since then, he felt that his magic power had improved by leaps and bounds, and he could control some unfamiliar places with ease. The ferret in his mind saw this scene and sat up suddenly. It carefully observed the door with Harry's eyes and for the first time corrected its attitude of playing with the world. Its small black eyes flashed with surprise. It waited for the moment when Harry stepped into the door. Harry was unconscious, he put his hand on the handle, twisted it hard, the door opened to him, and Harry walked in. The ferret was disappointed. It was just an ordinary classroom. At the innermost side there was a bookshelf, on which were some books about alchemy, and there was a window, looking out, facing the Quidditch playground. There were some people training there. Under the window, there was a light green sofa, next to it was a small white desk, on which were placed a few pots of clivia. Harry was a little confused as to why the sofa was green. Could it be that in his subconscious, he still preferred Slytherin? Harry thought of Malfoy and was instantly relieved. Harry immersed his consciousness into that mysterious space, walked to the glass wall, greeted the little ferret next to him, and then carefully observed Quirrell. He was still sleeping, and the purple turban was gone, revealing the back of his head. A few lines of words suddenly appeared on the glass wall. Task 15, invite Malfoy and Ron to have lunch together. Time limit, before 2 o'clock this afternoon. Mission success, flying ability increased by 10, mission failure, absorbing 1/3 of Quirrell's, Voldemort, soul. On the wall, the 3 words Voldemort were slightly distorted, appearing and disappearing. Harry looked at them for a long time before he successfully recognized them. The heavy stone in his heart finally fell to the ground. Harry came out of his consciousness and waited quietly for the deadline of the task. The stoat complained, "No, you're really hungry now, how can you eat everything?" It kindly advised Harry, "Although you can enhance your magic power, if you absorb too much, you will no longer be yourself. When the soul exceeds the carrying capacity of the body, it will explode," the stoat said earnestly. "What's more, it looked at him with disdain, "too ugly and dirty, he will pollute your soul." Harry didn't listen, because when he absorbed Draco's soul, nothing unusual happened. And he hated Voldemort so much that he wished his soul would disappear forever and turn into ashes. Harry sat quietly on the sofa, watching the sun rise to the highest point in the sky, his deep green eyes filled with comfort. While eating the sandwich that Dobby brought from the kitchen, he looked at the alchemy books on the bookshelf next to him, feeling quite touched. The Voldemort in his head woke up and looked at the scene in front of him. It was pitch black all around him with only a handful of stars in it. There was a transparent wall in the farthest distance, and it was useless for him to cast any spell. He had realized that he had been deceived by Harry. Voldemort tried to apparate, but there was no reaction from the surroundings. He suddenly turned into a puff of black smoke, trying to escape to the highest point, with no end in sight. Harry looked down, watching this man struggling to survive, watching him with nowhere to go, and felt like he had gotten his revenge. Soon, Voldemort calmed down and released Quirrell. Quirrell was a little timid when he came out. He tried to get close to the wall and pushed it. His warm palm touched the cold glass and his hand trembled. Harry's face suddenly appeared in front of him, and Quirrell tapped the wall hard, motioning for Harry to look at him. "Harry, good Harry, I'm your professor, can you please let me out?" The cowardly man pleaded with the child in front of him who was decades younger than him in a hoarse voice. Harry was indifferent. He looked quietly at the former professor of Muggle studies in front of him. Now the man had turned into the hideous Voldemort, with no nose, snake-like eyes, and turned pale. Dumbledore fell from the tower, and Snape's murmur of always gradually became weaker, followed by Voldemort's laughter. He cruelly fed his loyal men to the big snake, swallowing them mouthful by mouthful. The piles of Muggle corpses, the quiet and steady George, the green light emitted from the woman's wand, hitting Sirius. The dagger thrown by Bellatrix pierced into Dobby's small body without stopping. It cut through the space, rushed out of Harry's memory, and pierced straight into Harry's heart. His heart ached and he felt worse than death. Harry knew that perhaps Professor Quirrell might be controlled by Voldemort, and would die if he absorbed Voldemort's energy, but he had no way to do anything. The time for the system to absorb souls next time has been determined. He had originally told the professor to stay away from the forests of Albania, but he didn't expect to follow the footsteps of his previous life. Perhaps he is no longer the same Harry. Hatred has blinded him, tormenting him day and night like a leech, making it difficult for him to sleep. Harry steeled himself and tried not to pay attention to Professor Quirrell's pleading. For today, he resisted the urge to go to Azkaban to rescue his uncle, and tolerated Peter Pettigrew eating and drinking for free at Ron's house, all in order to prevent Voldemort from noticing anything unusual and allowing him to come to Hogwarts, which had long been a trap set up for him. He was afraid that there might be some connection between the Horcruxes, so even though he knew something about it, he still left them where they were. He turned around and asked the ferret if it was okay now, if the mission had failed, but before the ferret could speak, he felt a stream of cool water sweeping over his body. His magic power surged again, but the dark side of his heart grew stronger again. Harry hurried out, sat on the sofa, holding orange juice, drinking while watching. He looked down at his dashboard. There had been no movement in the past few years since he let Malfoy go. Now his data had finally changed. Chapter 19. Asking. Name, Harry Potter. Age, 11 years old. Physical fitness, 30 plus 10, full score is 100, you are doing okay now, swallowing is no problem, you won't go to the hospital, and other students won't know about your fetish. Appearance, 76 plus 5, full score is 100, how to say it, you are neither effeminate nor feminine, you can be a gigolo, it is hard to imagine that you have such a hobby. Soul strength, 75 plus 10, out of 100, you are really hungry, nauseous, and want to vomit. A large piece of mosaic things floats by. What is the difference between this and asking me to eat shit? Intelligence level, 50 plus 10, out of 100, with your IQ, I can understand why you chose to eat that piece of shit. Mana reserve, 20 plus 20, full score? Oh, you endured that and only increased it by this much. Oh, I feel sorry for you. Plant affinity, 5 plus 20, full score is 100, this has nothing to do with that lump, Indian brother has contributed a lot to you. Alchemy talent, 70 plus 15, full score is 100, there is gold in that shit? No wonder, eat less next time. Potion ability, 65 plus 5, full score 100, how did you increase this? Combat skills, 70 plus 15, full score 100, thank you so much for your unspeakable, stinky daddy. The art of language, 3 plus 20, full score is 100, I have never seen such a thing before, excrement has become a spirit and can speak human language. Flying ability, 80 plus 10, full score is 100, no wonder it was increased, I'm a jet warrior. Next time, I say next time, if you do this again, I will die with you. Harry spat out a mouthful of orange juice, which was all over the sofa, the alchemy book, and everywhere. He was stunned, but instead of feeling angry at the sarcasm, he was filled with indescribable joy. In its head, the weasel saw this scene and took a closer look. This line of words was the first time it saw its partner so irritable. Ha 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 ha. After cleaning up, Harry cleaned up the sticky juices on and around himself. Will Voldemort see it too? With this thought in mind, he went into his mind and looked at Quirrell, whose expression was dull. His temperament suddenly changed, his pupils dilated, and he stared at the lines of text flashing on the screen. A mouthful of blood spurted out and sprayed onto the glass wall, where it was absorbed. He had never been so insulted in his life. "Harry Potter, I will never be reconciled with you." Voldemort tried hard to open his eyes and looked at Harry, who was now in a superior position, with a cold expression and contempt in his eyes, looking at him so humble. Voldemort lowered his head and sneered slightly. Although the child had had an adventure, he was still too immature and didn't know that there were forces in the world that could hurt people and there were curses. In addition, he absorbed some of his soul, which cut off some of his violent temper, and his mind became clearer. Now thinking back to that book, is there no one in the pureblood family who knows about it? Why haven't I seen anyone practicing this? It seems that the side effects are tacitly known to them. It seems that when I got the book, I had already stepped into Dumbledore's trap. If I stay sober, it might be possible to do something like Grindelwald, but now he has become a prisoner of this child. Voldemort looked around. The mysterious space and those erratic runes might be his chance, a chance to get closer to immortality. Harry didn't notice, he was enjoying the annual happy time, which was even happier than when he married Ginny. He looked at Voldemort in silence without thinking much. With the support of the system, it was simply wishful thinking and a fantasy for him to escape. The ferret noticed this, and it looked over closely, but didn't say much. Some truths can only be understood by those who have experienced them themselves, and it was doing it for Harry anyway. Malfoy, who had just finished class, ran to find Harry. When he received the note last night, he clearly wanted to wait until after dinner before running to Professor Quirrell and slipping the note to him. But for some reason, after he had this thought, his mind went blank, and he had no memory of that time afterwards. When he woke up, it was already class time the next day. He hurriedly told Harry the news, saying that he had lost the note. Draco went to ask his classmates if there was anything abnormal about him last night, but to no avail. However, there was a little boy with black hair who had a long conversation with him. The people watching could not remember the appearance of the little boy, they just looked confused. They only remembered that there was such a person, but they did not remember his face. The black hair swaying back and forth, the blank face, the thin body, like a ghost, are chilling. After Slytherin had one more person, he disappeared again, but it did not cause panic because this person slowly disappeared from their memory. Someone tore up the group memory on a large scale, and no one noticed, except Malfoy. He looked at his classmates around him laughing, cursing, playing, and fighting. The paper planes of the Velas twins flew from the Gryffindor table to Slytherin and suddenly landed in the teacup in front of Malfoy. Draco felt like he couldn't keep up with the times. After all, he was already past that age. Fortunately, Harry was the same as me. Thinking of this, Draco felt a little comforted. He looked at the paper airplane in the cup and found it somewhat amusing. Malfoy mustered up the courage to find Harry. He wanted to apologize to him. He wondered if he had messed up Harry's plans. But when he ran to the Gryffindor table, the little wizards who saw what happened thought they could see a good show. Some Hufflepuff wizards even picked up melon seeds in their jars. But they were disappointed by what happened. Malfoy did not see Harry in Gryffindor, and the little lions on the table looked at the little snake among the lions in surprise. At this time, Ron, who was sitting at the table, was looking at this platinum-colored young master for the first time in this world. He thought of Malfoy's experience in the story, and felt a little sad. He looked at Draco with loving and pitying eyes, at this dawn that could not brighten and dusk that could not darken. Draco felt the red-haired man's gaze and was offended. Who was he pitying? He was the young master of the Malfoy family, did he need the pity of a poor red-haired guy? But he didn't say it out loud, Harry's thoughts were more important. He turned around and asked Hermione, the future Minister of Magic is still worth making friends with, and can become a friend of his Malfoy family, even if she is a Muggle-born. Hermione, who was standing next to him, heard it, and she said to Draco, Harry should be in the infirmary. No, Draco responded, I've been to the infirmary, and Madame Pomfrey said Harry wasn't there at all. Hey? Hermione was a little surprised. Maybe Harry came back for dinner and you missed him, Ron interrupted. As for where Harry went, Ron said, is there any need to worry about the Savior? Maybe in just this short time, his magic power has increased dramatically and he has learned almost all the spells. If an ordinary person disappears, it may be a real disappearance. If the protagonist disappears, it means he is going to obtain gold, silver, treasures, and magical skills. It is better for us mortals not to disturb them. Chapter 20. Lively. Draco looked at Ron, who was indifferent and nonchalant, and felt that something was wrong. Why was the red-haired Velis so easy to talk to today and seemed so eager to find Harry? He suppressed his doubts and pulled Ron along. As Harry's buddy from his previous life, they should have some telepathic connection, right? The two of them wandered around the castle. Ron looked at the armor in the corridor and the murals above. He felt like he was exploring a medieval European castle. On second thought, this is pretty much the same. Looking at the moving portraits and that silly-looking troll picking his nose, wow, he looks so stupid. Wait, a troll? A troll holding a stick and holding its nose. Ron seemed to know where this was and was immediately very excited. Draco, who was in a hurry to get going, turned around and saw Ron standing there stupidly, so he walked over impatiently. What are you doing, stupid Velis? His originally frowned brows suddenly relaxed, and the whole person stood there. Breathing became extremely difficult, and the surrounding was filled with the laughter of that crazy woman. The past, long-lost memories emerged. This was something he wanted to avoid after his rebirth, and it suddenly appeared before his eyes. Countless repairs, his father imprisoned in Azkaban, the villains who curry favor with the powerful, Voldemort's Cruciatus, and Dumbledore's blue eyes. The wand he held tightly had been shaking until now, but he still could not become a ruthless person. Draco wanted to tell himself that none of this had happened. Harry had been reborn, and had brought with him a very powerful thing, and Voldemort could not be their opponent. However, his heart, which was tightly grasped by someone, told him that he had never gotten over the battle. Ron turned around in surprise and saw Malfoy standing there in a daze. He stretched out his arm and waved it in front of his eyes. "What's wrong with you?" Ron asked in confusion. Draco seemed to have just come to his senses, but his eyes were immediately filled with surprise. Ron turned around and saw Harry standing quietly behind them with a smile on his face. Ron felt very strange. How come Harry looked different after not seeing him for a while? He looked closely and it seemed that there was no difference. He had become more handsome. Does that count? The three of them fell silent for a moment, and it was Draco who spoke first, explaining what happened last night. Harry listened carefully, not avoiding Ron. Harry already knew that Ron had followed him last night, and Draco realized after he came to his senses that Ron also seemed to know about the Room of Requirement. Did his brother tell him? Or did he and Harry have an agreement to meet at the door of the Room of Requirement later? This made Draco feel a little bit uncomfortable. When he knew that Harry didn't blame him, he breathed a sigh of relief and said goodbye to Harry. After all, he still had classes in the afternoon and couldn't skip classes. Harry turned around and went to the library, first looking for a spell or magical creature that could complete what Draco had said. Ron was not interested in these things, he was so sleepy now and was going to take a nap. Both of them tacitly ignored why Harry was there. At the door of the library, Harry was afraid to go forward. There were many young wizards studying inside. Although he had taken advantage of his foresight and was ahead of his peers, he himself did not become studious. The adult thinking still forced Harry to go in and sit on the chair with a fearless attitude. I picked up a few books on magical animals and alchemy and forced myself to read them. The ferret in my mind looked at the crazy people in the glass wall, then looked at the people who regarded books as a scourge, and sighed helplessly. It seems that I have to make a move. When Harry returned, he did not hear any news about Professor Quirrell, nor did he hear any news about the professor's disappearance. The few people who had taken the defense against the dark arts class first praised Professor Quirrell and highly respected him, claiming that Professor Quirrell was the next Dumbledore, which made the young wizards who respected Dumbledore very angry. Now, the Great Hall was in a state of uproar, and Peeves was happily rummaging around under the ceiling, picking out lucky people with a piping bag of cream. From time to time, a lump of white cream fell from the sky, splashing a few insults against Peeves in the noisy crowd. This was like adding a catalyst to a chemical reaction, making Peeves' reaction even more boiling. The Veles twins on the table also joined in the farce. George quietly aimed the fireworks at the door, wanting to give a big surprise to the first person who walked in. Fred threw the specially made atmosphere balloon bombs towards the place where the fun people gathered. Bang! The glittering, sparkling pieces of paper flew in the air, and the sweet cream rushed towards the noisy crowd. Some went into books to study knowledge, some returned to their homeland and fell on the cake, and some settled in their own destination, turning into a sweet liquid and exploring the intestines. A little girl from Ravenclaw stood on the table, her long black hair falling to her shoulders, and she took out a leaf and played a tune. Although the sound was dim, she was still immersed in her own world, ignoring the eyes of others. "Stop it!" There was a roar. Not many people heard it, only George trembled and hid aside, hiding himself under the table. The man was Snape, wearing a black wizard robe that was loose and greasy. There were a few conspicuous creams on his black hair, which gradually slid down, and there were a few small pieces of colorful paper on top. The whole person looked like a few bright candies dotted on a black chocolate cake. He glared fiercely at Dumbledore, who was watching the fun nearby. Don't think that because he cast the disillusionment charm, he couldn't tell that he was watching the fun. Then he cleaned up his things with a blank look in his eyes and an expressionless face, but his suppressed anger was still visible at a glance. He pushed through the crowd and walked to the center. The little wizard turned around and changed from glaring at him at the beginning to being cowardly, lowering his head, wishing he could hide in the crack of the ground. Harry followed Professor Batman in order to watch the fun, but when he saw Ron's red face and Malfoy, who was giving instructions from behind him, he was a little surprised. What was going on? Snape walked to the center, the noisy little wizards gradually quieted down, and the crowd gradually dispersed. The Hogwarts refrigerant was worthy of its reputation. The professor waved his wand and tied up several troublemakers in the crowd together. George, who sprayed him with ribbons, and Peeves, who threw cream at him, were also among them.